Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Margaret Ashworth, but everyone just calls me Maggie. I've been a ranger here in Jefferson National Forest for 9 years now, and I'm the first woman they ever hired for this district. People always ask me how I ended up in these mountains, carrying a medical kit bigger than most folks' suitcases. Truth is, after what I saw in Vietnam, all those kids who looked like walking skeletons, I figured the worst thing I'd ever see was behind me. I was wrong about that. It was March of 1971, and we were coming off the worst winter anyone could remember. 15 feet of snow had been sitting on these mountains since December, with temperatures dropping to 25 below. The old-timers said they'd never seen anything like it, not in 80 years of living up here. I was stationed up near Mount Pleasant, close to Amherst County. Pretty name for a place, but there wasn't much pleasant about it that winter. The snow was so deep that the state couldn't get supply trucks up the mountain roads. Most of the families who lived in the hollows were completely cut off. We'd been trying to do welfare checks by snowshoe, but even that was getting dangerous. See, Mount Pleasant has a dark history. During the Civil War, there was a siege here that lasted months. Union soldiers got trapped in these same mountains, and when their supply lines got cut, they starved. I mean really starved. The kind where people start looking less like humans and more like something else entirely. The old folks still talked about finding bones scattered through these woods, decades after the war ended. I should have paid more attention to those stories. That morning in March, I was checking on the Henderson family. They lived about 8 miles up a trail that was more like a frozen river than a path. I'd been worried about them because we hadn't seen smoke from their chimney in 3 days. In weather like that, no smoke usually meant no life. The snowshoes made a squeaking sound with every step, and my breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see through them. My medical bag felt heavier than usual, probably because I'd packed extra supplies. Something about the silence up there made me nervous. Not the good kind of quiet you get in the woods, but the wrong kind. The kind that makes you wonder where all the birds went. When I finally reached their cabin, I knew something was bad wrong before I even got to the door. The chimney was cold, just like we'd thought, but the strange part was how perfect everything looked. No broken windows, no signs of trouble. Even the woodpile was still neatly stacked, though it should have been used up weeks ago. I knocked, called out, waited, nothing. The door wasn't locked. Mountain folks rarely lock their doors, especially when they might need help. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and that's when I saw them. The whole family, Jim Henderson, his wife Mary, and their 3 kids, were sitting around the dinner table. They were all dressed nice, like they were expecting company. The table was set with their good dishes. Forks and knives laid out perfect, napkins folded neat, but they were all dead. Now, I'd seen plenty of death in Vietnam, so that part didn't shake me. What made my hands start trembling was how they looked. These people had been cut off from supplies for 3 months. They should have been nothing but skin and bones. Instead, they looked healthy. Well-fed, even, like they'd just finished a big meal. The weird part was the dishes. They were all clean and empty, arranged like someone had just cleared away a feast. But when I checked their pantry, their root cellar, every cabinet in the house, there wasn't a scrap of food anywhere. Not even an old can of beans or a bag of flour. It was like every bit of food in that house had just disappeared. I radioed back to the station, told them what I found. My supervisor, Bill Murphy, said he'd get the county coroner up here as soon as the weather cleared. But that might be days, and we had 5 more families to check on before dark. As I was getting ready to leave, I heard something that made me stop cold. It sounded like scratching, real faint, coming from underneath the house. Like someone was down there, dragging their fingernails across the wooden floor. I called out, thinking maybe one of the family had somehow survived, was hiding in the crawl space. The scratching stopped. Then it started again, but this time it was coming from outside, moving around the house in a slow circle. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. The snow was smooth and white in every direction, no tracks except the ones I'd made coming up the trail. but I could still hear that scratching, closer now, like it was right under my feet. That's when I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. In the snow about 20 yards from the house, there was a set of footprints. Human footprints, bare feet, walking away from the cabin. But these weren't normal tracks. They were too long, too narrow, and spaced too far apart. Like whoever made them was either impossibly tall or taking steps twice as long as any person should be able to take. I followed those tracks for about 100 yards before they just stopped. Not like the person had been picked up or fallen down. They just ended, right in the middle of a flat stretch of snow, like whoever was walking had just disappeared into thin air. When I got back to the cabin, the scratching had stopped. But I noticed one more thing that hadn't been there before. On the dinner table, right next to the empty plates, someone had left a handful of old coins, Civil War era, from the look of them. Union Army issue. I've never believed in ghosts or spirits or any of that nonsense. After what I saw in the war, I figured the real world had enough horrible things in it without making up new ones. But standing there in that too quiet cabin, looking at those impossible tracks in the snow, I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, there were some kinds of hunger that could outlive the body that felt them. And maybe, just maybe, that hunger was still walking around these mountains, looking for its next meal. Dr. Hardy met me at the Morrison cabin the next morning. He was the county coroner, but more than that, he was the closest thing we had to a real doctor for 50 miles. Hardy was maybe 60 years old, with hands that shook a little, but eyes that missed nothing. He'd been coming up to these mountains since before I was born. Hell of a thing about the Hendersons, he said, stomping snow off his boots. You sure about what you saw? I told him everything. The empty house, the full-looking bodies, those strange tracks in the snow. He listened without interrupting, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Can't say I blamed him. If someone had told me the same story, I'd have figured they were seeing things too. Let's check on the Morrisons first, he said. Then we'll head back to the Henderson place and I'll take a proper look. The Morrison cabin was smaller than the Hendersons' place, tucked back in a grove of pine trees that blocked most of the wind. As we got closer, I could smell something that made my stomach turn. Not death, I knew that smell too well. This was different, sweet and rotten at the same time, like fruit that had gone bad. Mrs. Morrison answered our knock, but when she opened the door, I barely recognized her. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a plump, cheerful woman who always had fresh bread cooling on her windowsill. Now she looked like she hadn't eaten in months. Her cheeks were sunken, her eyes had dark circles around them, and her clothes hung off her like they were made for someone twice her size. But the strangest part was how she was acting. She kept smiling this big, happy smile, and talking about the wonderful meal she'd just finished. "Oh, you should have seen it," she said, ushering us inside. Roast beef and potatoes, fresh corn, apple pie still warm from the oven. I'm so full I can barely move. Dr. Hardy and I looked at each other. The kitchen table was set for one, with a clean plate and silverware, but there was no food anywhere, no dirty dishes, no smell of cooking, nothing. "Mrs. Morrison, doctor," Hardy said gently, "when did you last eat?" She laughed, a sound that was too bright, too cheerful. "Just now, of course. Didn't you hear me? I just had the most wonderful meal." She patted her stomach, which was clearly empty. "I'm absolutely stuffed." Her husband came in from the back room, and he looked even worse than she did. His skin was gray, and I could see his ribs through his shirt, but like his wife, he was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Doctor, good to see you," he said. "You're just in time for supper. Martha's making her famous pot roast." There was no pot roast. There was no food at all. When I checked their pantry, it was completely bare, just like at the Henderson place. But both of them kept talking about meals they'd eaten, describing them in perfect detail, the taste, the smell, how satisfied they felt. Dr. Hardy took Mrs. Morrison's pulse, checked her eyes, felt her stomach. When he was done, his face was pale. "Maggie," he whispered, "this woman is starving to death. They both are. But they don't seem to know it." That's when we heard it. That same scratching sound I'd heard at the Henderson cabin, coming from underneath the floor. But this time it was louder, more deliberate, like someone was trying to claw their way up through the boards. The scratching moved across the floor, following us as we walked around the room. Mrs. Morrison didn't seem to notice it, but her husband's eyes kept darting toward the sound. When the scratching stopped right under where he was standing, he started talking faster and louder about the imaginary food. "You really should try Martha's apple pie," he said, his voice shaking. "It's the best you'll ever taste. Sweet and perfect and filling. So filling you'll never be hungry again, Doctor." Hardy grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, now." As we were putting on our coats, I noticed something new on the Morrisons' table. 3 old coins, arranged in a neat row next to the empty plate. Same kind I'd seen at the Henderson place, Civil War-era Union money. Outside Doctor. Hardy was breathing hard, like he'd just run up a mountain. 40 years I've been practicing medicine," he said. "Never seen anything like that. Those people are dying of starvation, but their brains think they're eating. It's not possible." "What do you think is causing it?" He shook his head. "I don't know. Some kind of hysteria, maybe. Or poisoning that's affecting their minds. But Maggie, if this spreads to the other families..." He didn't need to finish. We both knew what he meant. If whatever was happening to the Morrisons reached the other isolated cabins, we'd have dozens of people starving to death while thinking they were fine. We decided to check one more family before heading back to town. The Carters lived about 2 miles east, in a little valley that stayed warmer than most places because it was sheltered from the wind. The first thing I noticed was that their chimney was smoking. That was good, meant they were burning wood, staying warm. But as we got closer, I saw that the smoke was the wrong color. Instead of the gray or white you'd expect from a wood fire, this smoke was yellowish and thick. Tom Carter met us at the door, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from gasping. He'd lost maybe 50 pounds since I'd last seen him. His face was so thin I could see the shape of his skull underneath his skin. But he was smiling and talking about the feast his wife was cooking. "She's got 3 chickens in the oven," he said, "and beans and fresh bread. You can probably smell it from here." The only thing I could smell was that same sweet, rotten odor I'd noticed at the Morrison place. And underneath that, something else. Something that reminded me of the field hospitals in Vietnam, where we kept the soldiers who weren't going to make it. Mrs. Carter was in the kitchen, stirring an empty pot on the stove. She was so thin, her wedding ring kept sliding off her finger, but she was humming a happy tune and talking to herself about how good the food smelled. "Just a few more minutes," she said to nobody in particular. "Then we'll have the best meal anyone ever tasted." The stove was cold. There was no fire, no food cooking, nothing. But both of them were acting like they were preparing for a holiday dinner. That's when I noticed the scratching again. But this time, it wasn't coming from under the floor. It was coming from inside the walls, moving around the room like something was trapped in there, trying to get out or trying to get in. "Doctor." Hardy checked them both, and when he was done, he pulled me outside. "They've got maybe a day left," he whispered. 2 at the most, but they don't know they're dying. Whatever's happening here, it's not natural." As we walked back to our snowshoes, I looked back at the cabin. For just a second, I thought I saw something moving in the window. Something tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old military uniform. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. Just Mrs. Carter, still stirring her empty pot, still humming that happy tune while her body slowly consumed itself. And on their kitchen table, I'd noticed 5 more of those old coins, arranged in a perfect circle around an empty plate. By the time we made it back to town that evening, Dr. Hardy looked like he'd aged 10 years. We sat in his office while he tried to make sense of what we'd seen. "It's spreading," he said, staring at his notes. "Whatever this is, it's moving from house to house. The Hendersons are dead. The Morrisons and Carters will be by tomorrow. And there are 6 more families up there we haven't checked yet." I called my supervisor and told him we needed help. State police, maybe the CDC, anybody who knew about diseases that affected the mind, but the roads were still blocked, and nobody could get through until the snow melted. "We're on our own until spring," Bill Murphy told me over the radio. "Do what you can, but don't take any unnecessary risks." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those families, starving to death while their minds told them they were eating the best meals of their lives, and those scratching sounds following us from house to house, and most of all, those coins. Union Army money from over 100 years ago, showing up fresh at every cabin. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep and drove back up the mountain. I told myself I was just going to check on the Morrison and Carter families, maybe see if there was anything I could do for them. But really, I think I was starting to understand that this wasn't a medical problem. This was something else entirely. The Morrison cabin was dark when I got there, but I could hear voices inside. Low, mumbly conversation, like people talking with their mouths full. I crept up to the window and looked in. Both of them were sitting at the kitchen table, having what looked like an animated discussion about the food they were eating. But their plates were still empty, and they were going through the motions of cutting and chewing nothing at all. Mrs. Morrison would lift her fork to her mouth, chew air, and smile with satisfaction. Her husband was doing the same thing, nodding and making comments about how delicious everything tasted. "Pass the potatoes, dear," he said to his wife. She reached across the table and handed him an empty bowl. He spooned nothing onto his plate and took a big bite of air. "Wonderful," he said. "Best you've ever made." I was about to knock on the door when I heard footsteps in the snow behind me. Slow, heavy steps, like someone walking who wasn't used to having feet. I turned around, and there was nobody there. But the footprints were plain as day in the moonlight. The same impossibly long tracks I'd seen at the Henderson place, leading right up to where I was standing. And they were fresh. Steam was still rising from them in the cold air. I followed the tracks around to the back of the house, where they stopped at the wall. Not like the person had gone inside, the tracks just ended at the wall itself, like whoever made them had walked right through the wood. That's when I heard the scratching again. But this time it was coming from inside the house. And with it, a new sound. Humming. A low, tuneless humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I went back to the front window and looked in. The Morrisons were still at their table, but now there was someone else with them. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and wearing what looked like an old Union Army uniform. The kind they wore during the Civil War, blue wool with brass buttons. But the uniform was rotted and torn, like it had been buried for 100 years. The thing's face was mostly hidden in shadow, but I could see its hands. They were nothing but bones held together with bits of dried skin, and they were moving across the table, arranging and rearranging those old coins. The Morrisons didn't seem to see it. They kept eating their invisible food and talking about how good it tasted. But every few seconds, they would glance in the thing's direction, and their smiles would get a little brighter, a little more forced. The creature turned its head toward the window, and for just a second, I saw its face. It was a skull with yellow lights burning in the eye sockets. Its mouth was open, showing teeth that were too long and too sharp. And it was smiling. It saw me. I ran. I don't remember getting back to my truck or driving down the mountain, but somehow I ended up at Dr. Hardy's house, pounding on his door at 2 a.m. He came to the door in his pajamas, took one look at my face, and let me in without asking any questions. "It's not a disease," I told him. "There's something up there, something that's making them think they're eating when they're starving." I told him everything I'd seen. The creature in the uniform, the impossible tracks, the way it had looked right at me through the window. I expected him to think I was crazy, maybe suggest I get some sleep and see how things looked in the morning. Instead, he just nodded. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said quietly, "about the Civil War, and what happened to those Union soldiers who got trapped up there. He said some of them got so hungry they stopped being human. Said hunger could become a living thing if it got strong enough. You believe that? I believe something killed the Hendersons and is killing the others. I believe it's connected to those coins and that scratching sound, and I believe we need to stop it before it moves on to the next family." We drove back up the mountain together just as the sun was coming up. The Morrison cabin was silent now, but we could see 2 shapes still sitting at the kitchen table. They were both dead, starved to death, sitting upright in their chairs with empty forks still in their hands and smiles still on their faces. On the table between them was a pile of those old coins, maybe 20 of them, arranged in a perfect spiral. And scratched into the wooden table, like someone had used a knife or maybe a claw, were words. "Still so hungry, need more, always more, doctor." Hardy checked his watch. "The Carters live about an hour from here. If we hurry." We didn't make it in time. Tom and Sarah Carter were dead too, sitting at their own table with empty plates and satisfied expressions. The scratched message on their table was longer: "Good food, good people, But still hungry, always hungry, need the one who remembers. What do you think it means, Doctor? Hardy asked. The one who remembers? I was starting to have an idea about that, but I didn't want to say it out loud, because I was pretty sure it meant me. I was the one who'd found all the bodies, seen all the evidence. I was the one who was starting to understand what was really happening up here. And if I was right, then this thing wasn't done with the mountain families. It was just getting started. That afternoon, we got a radio call from the Williams family, who lived on the far side of Mount Pleasant. They wanted to report that they were having the most wonderful dinner party, and did we want to come join them? The thing was, I knew for a fact that the Williams family had run out of food 2 weeks ago. The state had been trying to get supplies to them, but their road was completely blocked. We need help, I told Dr. Hardy. Real help. This thing is moving faster now. What kind of help can stop something like that? I thought about the scratched messages, about the Civil War coins, about that creature in the rotted uniform. Maybe the kind that's been buried up here for over 100 years. That's when I remembered something my grandmother used to say back when I was a kid. She'd grown up in these mountains, heard all the old stories. Some hungers, she used to tell me, are too big to die with the body that felt them. Some hungers just keep walking around, looking for someone new to feed them. I was starting to think she might have been right. That night, I did something that probably wasn't smart. I went back to my cabin and opened every history book I had about the Civil War in Virginia. I needed to know what really happened up here, what created something hungry enough to outlive death. What I found made my hands shake. In February of 1864, a Union supply column got cut off in these mountains during a Confederate siege. 47 soldiers, trapped in a valley with no food and no way out. The siege lasted for 6 weeks. By the time Confederate forces found them, only 3 were still alive. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. The survivors reported that the dead soldiers had been getting up at night, trying to eat food that wasn't there. They said the hunger had gotten so strong it started living on its own, separate from the men who felt it. The Confederate soldiers who found them were so disturbed by what they saw that they burned the entire camp. But they never found all the bodies. The reports said 7 soldiers were missing, never accounted for. And the location of that camp? Right where Mount Pleasant sits today. I called Dr. Hardy and told him what I'd learned. We decided to drive up to the Williams place and see if we could help them before it was too late. We never made it that far. About halfway up the mountain road, my truck just stopped. Engine died, lights went out, radio went dead. We sat there in the dark for maybe 5 minutes before we heard the scratching. It was coming from all around us. Under the truck, on the roof, against the windows, like dozens of fingernails dragging across metal. Then we saw the lights. Yellow lights, moving through the trees toward us. Not flashlights or lanterns. These lights had no source. They just floated in the darkness, bobbing up and down like they were attached to something walking. "Get out," Dr. Hardy whispered. "Get out and run." But it was too late. The lights surrounded the truck, and now I could see what was carrying them. 7 figures in rotted Union Army uniforms, their faces nothing but skull and shadow. The tallest one stepped forward, and when it spoke, its voice sounded like wind blowing through dead leaves. "You remember," it said, looking right at me. "You know what we are, what we need. What do you want?" I managed to ask. "To be full," it said, "to feel satisfied, to have enough. We have been hungry for so long, so long." The other figures moved closer. I could smell them now, not just death, but something deeper. The smell of starvation itself, of bodies consuming themselves from the inside out. "We tried to eat," the creature continued, "tried to feed on the mountain people. But they died too quickly. Their bodies gave up before we could take enough. We need someone stronger. Someone who has seen real hunger before." It was talking about Vietnam. About the children I'd tried to save, the ones who looked like walking skeletons. It knew about my memories, my guilt over not being able to help them all. "You understand hunger?" it said. "You have fed it before. You can feed us now." That's when I understood what was really happening. These things didn't just want to eat food. They wanted to eat the feeling of being satisfied. They wanted to drain that ability right out of people, leaving them to starve while thinking they were full. And they thought I would be a better meal because I'd seen starvation before, because I knew what it looked like, what it felt like to be helpless while people died of hunger. "No," I said. The creature tilted its head like it was surprised. "You have no choice," it said. "We are hunger itself. We cannot be fought, we cannot be killed. We can only be fed." "Maybe," I said, getting out of the truck slowly. "But I know something you don't know." "What is that?" "I know why you're really here. It's not just about being hungry. You died feeling like you failed. You were soldiers, and you couldn't protect the people you were supposed to protect. You starved, and you felt like it was your fault." The creature stepped back, and for a second, the yellow light in its eyes flickered. "I felt the same way in Vietnam," I continued. "All those kids I couldn't save, all that hunger I couldn't stop. I know what it's like to carry that guilt." The other figures were moving closer, but the tall one held up a skeletal hand to stop them. "You want to be satisfied?" I asked. "You want to feel full? Then stop making the same mistake you made 100 years ago. Stop trying to take what you need from innocent people." "Then how?" it whispered. I thought about those families, dying with smiles on their faces while they starved. I thought about the children in Vietnam, and how I'd learned to live with not being able to save them all. By accepting that some hungers can't be fed, I said, by letting go of the guilt that's really eating you, by remembering that you did your best with what you had. The creature stared at me for a long moment. Then, very slowly, it reached into its rotted uniform jacket and pulled out a handful of those old coins. "We left these," it said. "Payment for meals we could not taste, trying to make it right." "You did make it right," I told him. "You fought for what you believed in. You died trying to protect people. That's enough. That has to be enough." One by one, the yellow lights in the creature's eyes began to fade, not going out but changing, becoming softer, warmer. "Enough," the tall one whispered. "Enough." They turned and walked back into the forest, their footsteps getting fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. The last thing I saw was the tall one stopping and looking back at me. "Thank you," it said, "for helping us remember." Then they were gone. Dr. Hardy and I sat in the truck for maybe an hour, neither of us saying anything. Finally, the engine started again, and we drove down the mountain in silence. We found the Williams family the next morning. They were alive, sitting around their kitchen table eating actual food, canned beans and crackers they'd been saving for an emergency. They looked tired and thin, but they were real-world hungry, not whatever those things had been doing to the other families. "Strangest thing," Mr. Williams told us. "Last night we were sitting here talking about how we were going to starve, and then all of a sudden we felt like we could think clearly again, like some kind of fog had lifted." The state got through with supply trucks 2 days later. By the end of the week, all the surviving families had been evacuated to town until spring. The official report blamed the deaths on exposure and malnutrition brought on by the severe weather. Dr. Hardy and I never talked about what really happened up there. What would have been the point? Nobody would have believed us, and the families who died were still dead, whether it was from starvation or something supernatural. But I did make some changes in my life. I transferred to a different ranger district, one that specializes in emergency food relief. I've spent the last 4 years helping coordinate supply drops to isolated communities during disasters. It's good work, important work, and every time I help get food to people who need it, I feel like I'm keeping a promise I made to some soldiers who died a long time ago. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear scratching sounds in the walls, but they're different now, softer, not like something trying to claw its way in, but like something saying goodbye. I keep a few of those old Civil War coins on my desk. Dr. Hardy found them scattered around the Morrison and Carter cabins after the creatures were gone. I like to think they were left as a final payment, a way of saying thank you for helping them find peace. Last month, I got a letter from a historian at the University of Virginia. He'd been researching the Civil War siege at Mount Pleasant, and he wanted to tell me something interesting he'd discovered. In 1920, he wrote, a group of hunters found the remains of 7 Union soldiers in a cave near where the siege took place. The soldiers had been buried with military honors, and a small monument was erected to mark the site. According to the hunters, the remains showed signs of severe malnutrition, but they also found evidence that the soldiers had been sharing their rations with local civilians who had been caught in the siege. Even while they were starving, they'd been trying to help others. Heroes, the historian called them. Men who died doing their duty. I drove up to Mount Pleasant last weekend and found the monument. It's small, just a stone marker with 7 names carved into it. Someone had left fresh flowers there, even though it's been over 50 years since it was put up. I sat there for a while, thinking about hunger and satisfaction and what it means to have enough. Thinking about those Union soldiers and the families they'd killed while trying to satisfy their own impossible need. But mostly thinking about how sometimes the hungriest people are the ones who are trying to feed others. I still carry my medical kit everywhere I go, still check on isolated families during bad weather. But now I pay attention to different things. Not just whether people have enough food, but whether they're carrying guilt they don't need to carry. Because I learned something up on Mount Pleasant that winter. Sometimes the hunger that eats people alive isn't in their stomachs. Sometimes it's in their hearts. And sometimes the only way to feed that kind of hunger is to forgive yourself for all the people you couldn't save and focus on helping the ones you still can. The scratching in my walls stopped completely about a year ago, but every now and then, when I'm up late working on emergency supply routes, I catch a smell in the air that reminds me of pine trees and fresh snow. And I like to think that somewhere up in those mountains, 7 old soldiers are finally resting easy, their hunger satisfied at last. My name is Ted Blackstone, and I've been a ranger in the Chattahoochee National Forest for 22 years. That's long enough to see every kind of accident you can imagine. Broken bones, lost hikers, bear attacks, hypothermia. I thought I'd seen it all until September of 1978, when I learned that some things in these mountains don't follow the rules I thought I knew. People always ask how I got into this job. Truth is, it runs in my family. My grandfather was a ranger here, and so was my dad. We're mountain people, born and raised in these Georgia hills. I know every trail, every rock face, every dangerous spot where city folks get themselves in trouble. That's my specialty, technical rescue, especially rock climbing accidents. When someone falls off Stone Mountain, they call me. Stone Mountain isn't like the famous one near Atlanta. This one's smaller but meaner. It's a granite dome that rises 1,600 feet straight up from the forest floor. No gentle slopes, no easy paths to the top. Just bare rock, hot as a griddle in summer, slick as ice when it's wet. The Cherokee used to call it the Sleeping Giant, and they had stories about it. Dark stories. But I never paid much attention to old legends. I should have. The mountain has always been trouble. Back in the 1922, they tried to quarry granite from the south face. Lost 3 workers in a single month, rock slides, equipment failures, 1 man just disappeared. They shut down the operation and left their tools behind. You can still see some of that old equipment today, rusted and half buried in the rock. Sometimes it looks like the stone grew around it, which doesn't make sense, but that's how it appears. My own son Danny loved that mountain. From the time he could walk, he wanted to climb with his old man. I taught him everything I knew, how to read rock, how to place protection, how to move safely on vertical stone. He was good at it, better than most adults. Maybe that's why I got careless. Danny died on Stone Mountain 3 years ago. 16 years old, strong as a bull, careful as I'd taught him to be. But rocks fall sometimes for no reason. That's what the report said, anyway. Rockfall. Natural causes. Case closed. My wife Sarah blamed me, said I should have kept him off the mountain, should have known better. She moved back to her sister's place in Atlanta after the funeral. We still talk sometimes, but it's not the same. She thinks I'm obsessed with the mountain now, spending too much time up there. Maybe she's right. What she doesn't understand is that I can't let other families go through what we did. I've made it my mission to keep people safe on Stone Mountain, especially kids. I check every rope, every harness, every piece of protection twice. I've written new safety protocols that most folks think are overkill. But if being careful means some other father doesn't lose his son, then I'll be the most careful ranger in Georgia. The TH. Cherokee stories talk about children who vanish into the rock during thunderstorms. They become stone children, trapped between the world of the living and the world of spirits. As a kid, those stories gave me nightmares. As an adult, I figured they were just old tales meant to keep children away from dangerous places. I was wrong about a lot of things. September of 1978 was brutal hot. Indian summer, they called it, with temperatures hitting 95 degrees every day and no rain in sight. The granite soaked up that heat like a battery, staying hot enough to burn skin even after sunset. It was peak season for family hiking, and Stone Mountain drew them like a magnet. Parents thought it would be fun to take their kids rock climbing. Most of them had no idea what they were getting into. That's when everything started to go wrong. The first call came in on a Tuesday morning. Melissa Hartwell, a teacher from Atlanta, had brought a group of 12 kids up for what she called an outdoor education experience. They were supposed to do some easy climbing on the lower faces of the mountain, nothing dangerous. She had permits, proper equipment, even hired a local guide. But when I got to their campsite at dawn, 3 kids were missing. They were right here, Melissa kept saying, her voice shaking. Tommy, Lisa, and Marcus. They were sleeping in that tent. She pointed to a small dome tent that sat perfectly normal, except for one thing. The back wall was pressed right against the rock face, like someone had set it up as close as possible to the granite. I checked the tent. No tears, no signs of struggle. The sleeping bags were still warm, but the kids were gone. Maybe they went exploring, I suggested, though I didn't like the feel of this. Kids don't usually wander off in the dark, especially not on a mountain. Tommy's afraid of the dark, Melissa said. He won't even go to the bathroom alone at night. He would never leave that tent. I organized a search. We spread out across the lower slopes, calling names, checking every crevice and overhang where a kid might hide or get stuck. The other children were scared, clustering around the adults and jumping at every sound. But we found nothing, no tracks, no dropped items, no sign that 3 children had ever existed. That's when Jake Morrison, the local guide, showed me something that made my skin crawl. Ted, you need to see this. He led me around to the north face, about 50 feet from the campsite. There, pressed into the solid granite like they'd been made in soft clay, were 3 sets of handprints. Small hands, child-sized. But these weren't normal handprints. They were pressed into the rock from the inside, like someone was pushing against the stone from behind it. The fingers were spread wide, and you could see every detail. Fingerprints, palm lines, even the texture of skin. They looked desperate, like the children were trying to push their way out of solid rock. That's impossible, I said, but I was running my fingers over the prints. They were real, warm to the touch despite being carved in stone that should have taken hours to mark. Jake was pale. There's more. He showed me the climbing gear. The missing kids had been wearing safety harnesses when they went to sleep. Standard procedure for overnight climbing trips. We found those harnesses embedded in the rock face, straps and buckles pressed into the granite like the stone had swallowed them. The metal parts were fused with the rock, but the straps were cut clean through, as if something sharp had sliced them from inside. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice. But as I stood there, staring at those impossible handprints, I heard what sounded like children laughing. The sound was coming from inside the mountain, muffled by tons of solid rock, but definitely there. Happy laughter, like kids playing a game. You hear that? I asked Jake. He nodded, his face grim. Started about an hour ago. Gets louder near the rock face. I pressed my ear to the granite. The laughter was clearer now, and underneath it I could hear voices, young voices, calling names. Tommy, Lisa, Marcus, come play with us. My blood went cold. Those were the names of the missing children. I pulled back from the rock and tried to think rationally. Maybe there was a cave system we didn't know about. Maybe the kids had found some hidden entrance and were trapped inside. It was the only explanation that made sense. We spent the rest of the day mapping every known cave and crevice on the mountain. I brought in equipment from the ranger station, ground-penetrating radar, sonic mapping devices, everything we had, but the readings showed solid granite all the way down. No caves, no hollow spaces, no way 3 children could be inside that rock. Still, we could hear them. As the day wore on, the voices got clearer. They were definitely the missing kids, calling for help, asking why nobody would come play with them. But the sounds never came from the same place twice. Sometimes we'd hear them from the north face, sometimes from the east, It was like the children were moving around inside solid stone. The other kids in the group were getting hysterical. Parents arrived to pick them up, and I didn't blame them for wanting to get away from that place. By evening, only Melissa, Jake, and I remained, along with a technical rescue team I'd called in from Atlanta. That's when the electrical activity started. Around sunset, I noticed my hair standing on end. Metal equipment began to spark and crackle. The air tasted like pennies, sharp and metallic. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, but they were still miles away. The granite itself seemed to be generating electricity. "We need to get off this mountain," Jake said, and he was right. Climbing gear and electrical storms don't mix. But I couldn't leave, not with 3 children somewhere in that rock. As darkness fell, the voices changed. They stopped calling for help and started calling for us. "Ranger Ted, come play with us. Come into the rock." They knew my name. They knew I was there. That's when I saw the first flash of movement inside the stone. For just a second, in the beam of my flashlight, I saw a child's face pressed against the inside surface of the granite. A boy's face, pale and translucent, looking out at me with eyes full of longing. It was Tommy Brennan, one of the missing kids. He was inside the rock, looking out, and his mouth was moving like he was trying to talk. But the only sound I heard was that terrible, joyful laughter echoing through the mountain. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. Children don't live inside solid rock. It's impossible. But I'd seen what I'd seen. As the first lightning bolt split the sky above Stone Mountain, I realized that everything I thought I knew about the natural world was wrong. The storm hit just after midnight, and that's when things got really bad. Lightning struck the mountain 3 times in the first hour, each bolt hitting the granite with enough force to light up the whole forest. But instead of grounding harmlessly like it should have, the electricity seemed to sink into the stone and stay there. The rock face glowed with a faint blue light, pulsing like a heartbeat. And the children's voices got louder. Come play with us. It's fun in here." My rescue team wanted to evacuate, and I didn't blame them. We'd set up a base camp about 100 yards from the rock face, far enough to be safe from lightning strikes. But even there, our equipment was going crazy. Radios crackled with static, GPS units spun wildly, and every piece of metal we had was building up electrical charge. "This is insane, Ted," said Captain Rodriguez from the Atlanta Rescue Squad. "We can't work in these conditions." He was right, but I couldn't leave. Those kids were in there somewhere, and they were counting on me. Besides, the storm was getting worse. Even if we wanted to evacuate, the trails would be washed out soon. That's when Maria Santos showed up. I'd called her around 10 o'clock, when I realized we were dealing with something beyond normal search and rescue. Maria is Cherokee, works as a cultural consultant for the Park Service. Her grandmother used to tell stories about Stone Mountain, the old stories my family had forgotten. She hiked up in the storm, soaked to the skin, but determined. When she saw the glowing rock face and heard the children's voices, she didn't even look surprised. "How long?" she asked. "Since this morning?" She shook her head. "No. How long has this mountain been taking children?" I thought about it. There have always been disappearances. Kids who wandered off trails, fell into ravines. We figured they were accidents. 47 children in 50 years, Maria said quietly. "I've been keeping count. All during electrical storms. All on this mountain. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. 47 kids, and I'd never connected the pattern. I was supposed to protect people in these mountains, and I'd missed something this big." "What are they?" I asked. "Lonely," she said. "The Cherokee called them the Stone Children. Kids who got caught in the mountain during thunder time. The lightning pulls them in, makes them part of the rock. But they're still children. They want friends, want to play, so they call to other kids." Another lightning strike lit up the mountain, and this time I saw them clearly. Dozens of small shapes moving through the granite like it was water. Children of all ages, from toddlers to teenagers, their ghostly forms visible in the stone. Some were dressed in modern clothes, others in older outfits. A few wore the kind of clothing kids would have worn 50 years ago. And they were all looking at us, pressing their faces against the rock surface, mouthing words we couldn't hear over the thunder. "They're not evil," Maria explained. "Just lost and scared." But they don't understand that bringing living children into the rock will kill them. To the stone children, death and life are the same thing. I was trying to wrap my head around this when Captain Rodriguez started screaming. One of his team members, a young climber named Pete, had gotten too close to the rock face. He'd been placing monitoring equipment when the latest lightning strike hit. Now he was stuck to the granite wall from the waist down, his legs sinking into the stone like it was quicksand. "Help me," Pete yelled. "I can't move. It's pulling me in." We rushed over with ropes and pulleys, but every time we tried to pull him free, he sank deeper. The rock was somehow becoming soft around him, flowing like thick liquid. But when we touched it anywhere else, it was solid granite. Worse, Pete was starting to change. His skin was taking on a gray color, like stone dust was seeping into his blood. And he was smiling, even while he screamed for help. "It feels good," he said, his voice dreamy. "They're so happy in here. They just want to play." I could see shapes moving around Pete's submerged legs, small hands reaching up through the rock, touching him, welcoming him. The stone children were trying to bring him into their world. "Cut him out," I yelled to Rodriguez. "Use the diamond saws." We'd brought industrial cutting equipment for exactly this kind of rescue. Rodriguez fired up the big saw and bit into the granite around Pete's waist. The blade cut through rock like it was cheese, but as soon as we pulled a chunk away, the stone flowed back together, sealing the gap. The mountain was healing itself. "The storm," Maria said urgently. "The lightning gives them power. They can change the rock as long as electricity flows through it." I looked up at the churning clouds. The storm was getting stronger, not weaker. We could be here for hours. That's when I heard a new voice among the children's calls. A voice I recognized. "Dad? Dad, is that you?" My heart stopped. Through the glowing granite, I could see a teenage boy with my dark hair and Sarah's green eyes. Danny. My son, who died 3 years ago, in a rockfall that maybe wasn't an accident at all. "Danny," I whispered. "I've been waiting for you, Dad. It's lonely in here without you. Come play with us." I took a step toward the rock face, my mind reeling. Danny was alive. My boy was alive, and he'd been trapped in this mountain for 3 years, and I'd never known. Rodriguez grabbed my arm. "Don't, Ted. That's not your son. Not anymore." But it was Danny. I could see his face clearly now, translucent but unmistakably him. He was reaching out through the stone, trying to touch me, and God help me, I wanted to touch him back. "Please, Dad. I'm so sorry about the fight we had. I just wanted you to be proud of me." The fight. The last conversation we'd ever had, the night before he died. He'd wanted to attempt a harder climbing route than I thought he was ready for. We'd argued, said things we didn't mean. I'd gone to bed angry, and the next morning he was gone. "I was proud of you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I was always proud of you." "Then come with me. We can climb together forever." I reached out toward the rock face, and that's when Maria tackled me, sending us both sprawling in the mud. "It's not him," she shouted over the thunder. "They take the shape of what you want to see. Don't listen." But I could still see Danny, and the hurt in his eyes was breaking my heart. Behind us, Pete was now buried up to his chest in granite, still smiling that dreamy smile. And I could hear more voices calling from the rock, dozens of children, maybe hundreds, all wanting us to join them in their stone world. The lightning was getting stronger. Each strike lit up more faces in the rock, more small hands reaching out. And I realized that if we didn't figure out how to stop this soon, we'd all end up like Pete, trapped forever in the mountain with the lonely children of stone. By 3 a.m, Pete was gone. The rock had swallowed him completely, and the last thing we saw was his face disappearing into the granite with that same peaceful smile. Through the stone, we could hear him talking to the other children, his voice joining their endless, happy chatter. "There are so many of them," Maria said, watching the ghostly shapes move through the mountain. Generations of lost children. The storm was at its peak now. Lightning struck the mountain every few minutes, each bolt feeding more power into the stone. With every strike, the children became more solid, more real. And they were getting braver. Small hands pushed through the rock face now, reaching out toward us. Child voices called our names, begging us to come play. Some of the older children, teenagers who'd been taken decades ago, were actually stepping partway out of the granite, their lower bodies still merged with stone but their torsos free. "We need to go," Rodriguez said. His remaining team members were backing toward the tree line, equipment abandoned. "This is beyond search and rescue." But I couldn't leave. Not with Tommy, Lisa, and Marcus still trapped in there. Not with Danny calling my name. That's when Maria told me the truth. "There is a way to free them," she said quietly. "All of them. But you won't like it." She explained the Cherokee ritual, passed down through her family. During the worst storms, when the stone children grew too hungry and too bold, her ancestors would send someone into the mountain, a willing adult who could find the heart of the collective and break it from inside. "It's a one-way trip," she admitted. "The mountain won't let you leave once you're inside, but you can free the children's spirits, let them move on instead of staying trapped." I thought about Pete, disappearing into the rock with that blissful expression. About 47 missing kids over 50 years. About Danny, reaching out to me with longing in his translucent eyes. "How?" I asked. "The lightning gives them power, but it also makes them vulnerable. When the next big strike hits, the boundary between flesh and stone disappears completely. You can walk right into the mountain, find the center, where they all gather. And then..." She pulled out a small leather bag filled with white powder. "Sacred clay from the riverbed. It breaks spiritual connections to the earth. Scatter this among them during the electrical surge, and they'll be free to move on. And me? You'll be trapped in their place. Someone has to anchor the mountain, keep it from reaching out again." I looked at the rock face, glowing with trapped lightning, filled with the shapes of lost children. Some of them had been there for decades, growing up in a stone prison, never knowing peace. Danny pressed his face against the inside of the granite, mouthing words I couldn't hear but understood. "Help us, Dad." Another massive lightning bolt split the sky, and for a moment, the boundary between the living world and the stone world vanished completely. I could see into the mountain's heart, a vast cavern filled with playing children, their ghostly forms dancing and laughing while thunder echoed around them. They weren't evil, they were just scared kids who'd been alone too long. "There has to be another way," I said. But even as I spoke, I saw movement at the edge of our camp. 3 small figures stumbling out of the forest. Tommy, Lisa, and Marcus, the children who'd disappeared that morning. But something was wrong with them. Their skin had a gray tint, and their eyes glowed, with faint blue light. "We're back," Tommy called, his voice echoing strangely. "We made new friends. They want to meet you." The children walked toward us, but their feet didn't quite touch the ground, and as they moved, I could see through them to the trees behind. "They're becoming stone children themselves," Maria whispered. "The mountain is using them as bait." Rodriguez and his team were running now, crashing through the underbrush toward the trail. I didn't blame them. This was beyond anything humans should have to face. "Ted," the ghostly Tommy said, his young face sad and pleading, "don't you want to play with us? It's so much fun in the mountain. You never get tired, and you never have to leave your friends." Behind him, Lisa and Marcus nodded eagerly, and through the glowing granite, I could see dozens of other children pressing forward, all of them reaching out, all of them calling my name. "Your son is here," Lisa said. "He misses you so much." Danny's face appeared in the rock again, clearer than before. "Please, Dad, I've been waiting so long." The next lightning strike was building. I could feel it in the air, the electrical charge making my hair stand on end. This would be the big one, the strike that would give the stone children enough power to break free completely. Maria pressed the bag of sacred clay into my hand. "It has to be now, Ted, before they get strong enough to leave the mountain." I looked at the clay, then at the ghostly children surrounding us, then at Danny's face in the stone. My boy, who I'd failed to save 3 years ago. Maybe I couldn't save him, but I could free him. The lightning began its descent toward the mountain. As the world exploded in white light and thunder, I ran straight at the rock face. The granite flowed like water around me, and I plunged into the heart of Stone Mountain, into the realm of the children who'd been trapped there for 50 years. The last thing I heard was Maria shouting something about love being stronger than lightning. Then the stone closed over my head, and I was home. Inside the mountain was nothing like I'd expected. There was light, somehow, and space. A vast cavern that couldn't possibly exist inside Stone Mountain, filled with the gentle glow of captured lightning. And everywhere I looked, there were children. They surrounded me immediately, dozens of them, all ages and from all eras. Some wore clothes from the 1,920 seconds, others from the 1,960 seconds, still others from last week. But they were all children, and they were all smiling. "You came," Tommy Brennan said, rushing up to hug my legs. "We knew you would come." Lisa and Marcus were there too, solid now, laughing and playing with kids I didn't recognize. They looked happy, but there was something hollow in their eyes, like they were forgetting who they used to be. "Where is he?" I asked. "Where's Danny?" They parted like a curtain, and there he was. My son, 16, forever, exactly as he'd looked the morning he died. But when he smiled at me, I saw the same hollow contentment in his eyes. "Dad," he said, wrapping me in arms that felt real and warm and impossibly cold at the same time. "I knew you'd come for me. I'm here to take you home, son." "But this is home now," Danny said, confused. "We're all together here. We play games and tell stories and never get hurt. Why would we want to leave?" I looked around the impossible cavern, at the dozens of children who'd been trapped here, and I understood. They weren't suffering. They were content. But they weren't alive, either. They were stuck between worlds, never growing up, never moving on, never finding whatever peace waited beyond life. "Because you deserve more than this," I told Danny. "You deserve to rest." I pulled out Maria's bag of sacred clay, and the children stepped back nervously. "What's that, Dad?" "Freedom," I said, and scattered the white powder into the air. The effect was immediate. The clay sparkled as it fell, each grain glowing with its own light. Where it touched the children, they became more solid, more real, but also more aware. The hollow contentment faded from their eyes, replaced by memory and understanding. "I want to go home," Lisa whispered, and started to cry. "My mom," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "I want my mom." One by one, the children remembered who they were, what they'd lost, and one by one, they began to fade. Not into stone, but into light. Peaceful light that rose up through the cavern and disappeared, carrying them to whatever waited beyond. Danny was the last to change. As the sacred clay settled on his shoulders, he looked at me with eyes full of love and forgiveness. "I'm sorry we fought that last night, Dad. I'm sorry too, son. Tell Mom I love her, every day." He smiled, my beautiful boy, and then he was gone, dissolved into light that rose up and up until it passed through the mountain and into the storm-dark sky. I was alone in the cavern, but not for long. Already, I could feel the mountain's pull, trying to make me part of itself. My feet were sinking into the stone floor, my legs growing heavy and cold. But something was wrong. The mountain was fighting the loss of the children, trying to keep at least one spirit trapped to maintain its power. The walls were cracking, the cavern shaking. If I stayed, I'd be crushed when it collapsed. That's when I heard Maria's voice, impossibly, echoing through the stone. "Love is stronger than lightning, Ted. Remember that." I thought about Danny, about the love that had brought me into this mountain, about Sarah, waiting in Atlanta, still grieving our son, about all the children I'd failed to save over the years, and all the ones I might still protect. Love is stronger than lightning. I pushed against the mountain's pull with everything I had, not fighting the stone, but loving it, loving the children it had sheltered, loving Danny enough to let him go. The granite around my legs began to soften, not to trap me, but to release me. I ran for the cavern wall, diving through stone that parted like water, racing toward the surface as the mountain's heart collapsed behind me. I burst from the rock face just as the storm broke, gasping and covered in granite dust. Maria was there, helping me to my feet, her face wet with tears of relief. "They're free," I told her. "All of them." The mountain was different now, quieter. The electrical glow was gone, and the stone felt truly solid for the first time in decades. Whatever had made it hungry for children was broken. Rodriguez found us 3 hours later, along with a full search and rescue team. We told them we'd found the missing children safe but shaken, that they'd been hiding in a cave system during the storm. It wasn't the truth, but it was close enough. Tommy, Lisa, and Marcus were fine, physically. They remembered nothing about their time in the mountain, just falling asleep in their tent and waking up in the forest when the storm passed. The doctors said they might have some lingering effects from mild hypothermia, but nothing serious. I went back to work the next week, but everything was different. Stone Mountain felt peaceful now, just another granite dome in the Georgia mountains. The Cherokee stories called it the sleeping giant, and now it truly was sleeping. I called Sarah that night, for the first time in 6 months. I saw Danny, I told her. In a dream. He wanted me to tell you he loves you. She cried then, and so did I, and for the first time since the accident, we talked about our son without anger or blame. Sarah moved back home for Thanksgiving. We're taking it slow, but we're healing. The mountain taught me that love is stronger than grief, stronger than guilt, stronger even than the pull of the grave. I still work as a ranger on Stone Mountain. Kids still come to climb, and I still watch over them with obsessive care. But now I know what I'm really protecting them from. Not just falling rocks or bad weather, but the loneliness that can trap us between worlds. The grief that can make us forget how to let go. Sometimes, on clear nights, I think I can see lights moving through the forest around the mountain. Not trapped spirits, but free ones, children playing in whatever realm they've found beyond this one. Danny might be among them, and that thought brings me peace. The Cherokee were right about Stone Mountain. It was full of stone children, lonely souls trapped between life and death. But they were wrong about one thing. Those children weren't dangerous. They were just scared and lost, looking for someone to show them the way home. I'm glad I could be that someone, even if it meant risking everything I had left. Love is stronger than lightning, Maria had said. She was right. Some nights, when the storms roll across the mountains, I still hear laughter echoing from the peaks. But it's different now. Joyful and free. The sound of children who finally found their way home. My name is Harold Whitmore, and I've been a park ranger for 11 years. I used to be a college professor studying plants, but that was before my wife died of cancer. After that, I couldn't stand being stuck in a classroom anymore. I needed to be outside, working with my hands, doing something real. I ended up at Sumter National Forest in South Carolina, taking care of Table Rock State Park. It's a beautiful place, especially in fall when the leaves turn red and gold. I'm 37 now, and my daughter Sarah is 16. She stays with her aunt during the school year, but visits me on weekends when she can. People think being a park ranger is just about giving directions to tourists and stopping people from littering. But my real job is watching the forest itself. I check on plant diseases, track how different species are growing, and make sure nothing's going wrong with the ecosystem. After all those years studying botany in college, I know plants better than most people know their own pets. That's why what happened in October 1982 scared me so much. Because I could see that something was very wrong, but I couldn't explain it using anything I'd learned in all my years of science. It started with the weather. October should have been cooling down, but it stayed warm like summer. The trees were changing colors, but underneath them, spring flowers were blooming. Daffodils and tulips were pushing up through the fallen leaves. I'd never seen anything like it. My research station sits 20 miles into the forest, where the old logging roads end. A helicopter brings me supplies once a month. The rest of the time, I'm alone with my equipment, my books, and the plants I study. I like it that way. Or I used to. The weird weather wasn't the only strange thing. Animals were acting different too. I found 3 deer last week, lying dead near the old part of the forest. They looked thin, like something had drained all the blood out of them. But there were no bite marks, no sign of a fight. They just looked empty. The spot where I found them was near what the local Cherokee people call the sad ground. A long time ago, during the Revolutionary War, soldiers died there and got buried in a mass grave. No one knows exactly where, because there's no headstone or marker. The army just dumped the bodies and left. That area has always grown different plants than the rest of the forest. Bigger ones, stranger colors. I figured it was because of all the old bones in the soil acting like fertilizer. Dead things make good plant food, after all. But this October, the plants there were getting huge. Vines thick as my arm wrapped around trees. Flowers big as dinner plates opened and closed like they were breathing. And the smell, it was too sweet, like perfume mixed with something rotten. I kept telling myself there had to be a scientific reason. Maybe chemicals from an old dump, or some kind of plant disease I hadn't seen before. I never believed in ghost stories or anything supernatural. I should have. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Martinez, my supervisor, told me a research team from the university had gone missing. 3 graduate students studying plant mutations. They'd been camping near Table Rock for a week, but missed their check-in call. Their last report mentioned unusual plant growth in the southern section, Martinez said over the radio. Same area where you've been finding those dead animals. I grabbed my gear and hiked out to find them. It took me 2 hours to reach their campsite, and when I did, I stopped walking and stared. The camp was still there, but it was wrong. 3 tents stood in a perfect triangle, but thick vines had grown up around them overnight. Green ropes as thick as my wrist wrapped around every piece of equipment. The vines hadn't been there a week ago. I was sure of it. I cut through the vines with my knife. The metal blade came away, covered in sap that smelled like copper pennies. Inside the first tent, I found sleeping bags and clothes, but no people. The other tents were the same. Personal stuff scattered around, but no signs of a struggle. What bothered me was how the plants had grown. They made perfect circles around each tent, leaving spaces exactly the size and shape of 3 human bodies, like the vines knew where people had been sleeping. I was taking pictures when I heard the rustling. It was loud, like wind blowing through leaves, but there was no wind. The air was perfectly still and warm. I turned toward the sound and saw something that made my hands shake. A massive flower, red as blood and big as a trash can lid, was opening and closing about 50 feet away. Each time it opened, I could see dark stains inside the petals. When I got closer, the stains looked wet and fresh. I took a sample of the liquid and tested it with my field kit. Human blood. My radio crackled. "Whitmore, you copy?" It was Martinez. "I found their camp," I said. "But they're not here. Send backup." "On my way. Don't touch anything else." While I waited, I walked around the area taking notes. More giant flowers dotted the forest floor. All of them had those dark red stains inside. Some had pieces of fabric stuck to the petals. A torn sleeve here, a bootlace there. But the worst part was the sound. Every few minutes, I heard something like voices whispering, just at the edge of hearing, like people talking very quietly in another room. I kept turning around, but no one was there, just plants rustling without any wind. Martinez showed up with 2 other rangers and a chainsaw. "We'll cut through this mess and find them," he said. But when we started cutting, the plants fought back. Not like normal plants, these vines moved away from the saw blade, wrapping around our equipment. The chainsaw quit working after 5 minutes, clogged with sap that ate through the metal chain. "This is impossible," Martinez muttered, pulling thick green stuff off his boots. The sap was trying to stick him to the ground. That's when we heard the scream. It came from deeper in the forest, toward the old burial ground. A human voice, calling for help. We grabbed our gear and ran toward it, but the plants seemed to grow thicker with every step. Vines reached across the path, trying to trip us. Branches hung lower, forcing us to duck and crawl. The screaming stopped just as we reached a clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood something that used to be a tree, but now looked like a nightmare. Its trunk was hollow and transparent, like a glass tube filled with murky water. And floating inside, barely alive, was Martinez's nephew, Rico, one of the missing graduate students. His eyes were open and moving, but the rest of his body was perfectly still. Thin roots had grown into his arms and legs. As we watched in horror, the tree pulsed like a heartbeat, and Rico's face went pale. It was feeding on him. "Get him out," Martinez screamed, attacking the tree with an axe. But every time he hit it, the tree healed itself. Worse, other plants started moving toward us. Flowers turned to track our movement like eyes. Vines reached out from every direction. We ran. We made it back to my research station, but barely. Plants had followed us the whole way, growing across the path behind us, cutting off our escape route. By the time we got inside and locked the door, we were trapped. "What the hell is happening out there?" Martinez gasped, checking his radio. Nothing but static. I pulled out every plant book I owned, looking for answers. But nothing I'd studied in college explained what we'd seen. Plants don't move like animals. They don't hunt people or drink blood. There has to be a logical explanation, I said, more to convince myself than Martinez. That night, we took turns staying awake and watching the windows. Around midnight, I saw lights moving outside. Not flashlights or lanterns. Soft green glows drifting between the trees like fireflies. But these lights were as big as basketballs, and they moved in straight lines, like they were searching for something. At dawn, the lights faded, but the plants outside had grown closer to the station. Vines covered the walls now, and strange flowers pressed against the windows like faces trying to look inside. Martinez tried the radio again and got through to headquarters. "Send a helicopter," he said. "Emergency evacuation." But when the helicopter arrived that afternoon, it couldn't land. The clearing around my station was filled with plants that hadn't been there the day before. Thick bushes and tall grass covered the landing pad. The pilot circled twice, then had to give up. "We'll have to hike out," Martinez said. We packed light and left through the back door. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Then we started finding things. Personal. Items from the missing students were scattered along the trail. A backpack hanging from a tree branch. A pair of glasses balanced on a stump. A field notebook placed carefully on a rock, open to a page that said, "The plants are watching us." But the items weren't dropped or lost. They were arranged. Placed in specific spots, like someone was leaving us a message. "It's playing with us," Martinez whispered. As the sun got lower, the whispers started again. Voices in the wind, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. Old-fashioned words, like people from a long time ago trying to talk. Then Martinez stepped on something that crunched. Looking down, we saw bones. Human bones, old and yellow, scattered across the forest floor. Skulls and rib cages mixed with rusted metal buttons and pieces of old cloth. Revolutionary War uniforms, rotted away to almost nothing. "This is the burial site," I said. "The unmarked grave." All around us, the giant plants grew thicker. Flowers as big as car tires opened and closed with wet, sucking sounds. The air smelled like a greenhouse mixed with a butcher shop. That's when we saw them. The missing students, all 3 of them, were still alive. Barely. They hung in transparent pods attached to enormous vines, like fruit growing on nightmare trees. Thin tubes connected to their bodies, slowly draining something from them. Their eyes moved when they saw us, but they couldn't speak. "We have to get them down," Martinez said. But as soon as we stepped toward the pods, the ground erupted. Roots thick as pythons burst up from the soil, reaching for our legs. Flowers opened to show rows of thorn teeth. The whispers became voices, angry and demanding, and then I heard words I could understand. "Bury us. With honor. Mark our graves." The voices came from everywhere at once. Dozens of men, speaking in the accent of colonial times, Revolutionary War soldiers, I realized, still angry after 200 years about being dumped in an unmarked hole and forgotten. The plants weren't just feeding on people. They were controlled by the spirits of dead soldiers, using the bodies to grow stronger, to get revenge for being disrespected. Martinez screamed. A vine had wrapped around his ankle and was pulling him toward a flower the size of a bathtub. Inside its petals, I could see sharp thorns dripping with something that smelled like acid. I grabbed his arms and pulled, but the plant was stronger. It dragged him closer to its mouth, and I could hear him starting to dissolve. I managed to cut Martinez free, but his leg was badly hurt. The plant acid had eaten through his boot and burned his skin. He couldn't walk without help. "Leave me," he gasped. "Get out of here." But there was nowhere to run. Plants surrounded us completely now, growing taller by the minute. Vines blocked every path. The voices of angry soldiers filled the air, demanding justice for crimes committed centuries ago. That's when I understood what they wanted. "You died fighting for America." I called out to the voices. "You deserve better than this unmarked grave." The whispers quieted a little. "Tell us your names," I continued. "Let me help you." The plants stopped moving toward us. In the sudden stillness, I heard a different voice. Older, sadder than the others. "Captain William Hayes, South Carolina Militia," the voice said. "Killed October 15th, 1780. Buried, without ceremony. Forgotten." Other voices joined in. Private John Miller. Corporal Thomas Flynn. A dozen names, then more. Men who had died young, fighting for freedom, then dumped in a hole like garbage. I looked around at the massive plants growing from their bones. Their anger and pain had fed these impossible flowers for over 200 years. But plants need more than anger to grow. They need care. I can mark your graves, I said. Put up a proper memorial. Make sure people remember your names. The giant flower holding Rico's pod opened slightly. Hope, maybe? But first, let these people go. They didn't hurt you. Take your anger out on me if you need to, but let the innocent ones live. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the pods began to lower. The students slid out, unconscious but breathing. The vines released Martinez's leg. You will remember us? The captain's voice asked. I promise. The plants pulled back, creating a clear path to the edge of the forest. But I didn't take it. Instead, I knelt among the old bones and started gathering them carefully, respectfully. Revolutionary War soldiers deserved a proper burial. As I worked, the voices told me their stories. Boys from farms and cities who had signed up to fight the British. Men who had marched for miles, fought with muskets and bayonets, died far from home. Their families never knew what happened to them. We fought. For honor, Captain Hayes said. Died. Without it. Not anymore, I said. The sun was setting as I finished arranging the bones in military formation, the way soldiers would be buried in an official cemetery. I took off my ranger hat and held it over my heart. Captain Hayes, Private Miller, all of you, thank you for your service. Your sacrifice meant something. America remembers. The words felt strange in my mouth, but they were true. These men had given their lives for an idea that people should be free. They deserved better than being forgotten in an unmarked hole. As I spoke, the giant plants began to shrink. Flowers closed and withered. Vines released their grip on the trees. The unnatural green glow faded from the forest. One by one, the voices whispered, "Thank you," and went silent. We carried the students out of the forest that night. All three survived, though they spent weeks in the hospital. Rico still has strange dreams about being inside that tree, but his doctors say his body is healing normally. Martinez and I told the authorities it was some kind of chemical contamination that caused hallucinations and plant mutations. They believed us, mostly because the alternative was too crazy to accept. But I kept my promise. 6 months later, the state of South Carolina dedicated a memorial at the site. A granite stone lists the names of every Revolutionary War soldier we could identify from military records. The inscription reads, "In honor of those who gave their lives for freedom, their sacrifice will not be forgotten." The area is peaceful now. Normal plants grow there, oak trees and wildflowers, nothing unusual. Tourists visit the memorial, and Boy Scout troops come to learn about the Revolutionary War. Kids leave small flags on the grave. I still work as a ranger, but I've changed. I pay more attention to the stories old-timers tell about the forest. I read more history books. I've learned that the past doesn't always stay buried, especially when injustice is involved. Sometimes, on quiet nights at my research station, I hear whispers in the wind. But they're not angry anymore. They sound grateful. And every year on October 15th, the anniversary of their deaths, I visit the memorial and place a wreath, just to let them know that someone still remembers what they did for us. Because I learned something important in that haunted forest. The dead don't always rest easy. Sometimes they need the living to help them find peace. And sometimes honoring the past is the only way to protect the future. My daughter Sarah asks me about that night sometimes. She's in college now, studying history. I've told her most of the truth, though she thinks the walking plants part is me exaggerating for effect. Maybe it is. Maybe stress and fear made me see things that weren't really there. But every spring, when I patrol that part of the forest, I notice something. The flowers that grow on the soldiers' graves are always a little bigger, a little brighter than normal. Like something down in the earth is still watching, still protecting the place where heroes sleep. I never believed plants could develop animal appetites. I still don't, not exactly. But I do believe that love and respect are just as powerful as anger and neglect, and that sometimes giving honor to the dead is the most important job the living can do. The forest remembers everything. The question is, what do we choose to remember back? My name is Catherine Holloway, but everyone at Mammoth Cave calls me Cat. I've been giving tours here in Kentucky for 7 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these underground tunnels had to offer. I was wrong. It was December 1986, right before Christmas. The cave entrance was decorated with wreaths and twinkling lights, trying to make the mouth of the earth look cheerful. Families came from all over to see our holiday programs. Kids loved my puppet shows where I taught them about cave safety using funny little characters I'd made myself. My own daughter, Emma, just 6 years old, would sit in the front row and giggle when Professor Spelunk the puppet would trip over his own feet. That morning started like any other. I checked my gear, flashlights, backup batteries, first aid kit, and my puppet bag. The weather report called for snow, but nothing too serious. Just another winter day in Kentucky. "Morning, Cat," called Jim from the visitor center. "You've got the Morrison family group today. 12 families total, lots of kids. Perfect for your puppet thing." I smiled and adjusted my red hair under my ranger hat. The kids love Professor Spelunk. He's got some new cave safety tips to share. The families gathered at the entrance right on time. Parents in heavy coats, kids bouncing with excitement, grandparents looking uncertain about going underground. Mrs. Morrison, a kind woman with tired eyes, had organized the whole trip for her son's birthday. "How deep are we going?" asked little Tommy, the birthday boy. I knelt down to his level, pulling out Professor Spelunk. The puppet had a tiny ranger hat and a miniature flashlight. "Well, Tommy," I said in the puppet's squeaky voice, "we're going on a wonderful adventure, but we always stay together underground, right? The cave is beautiful, but it's easy to get lost if we wander off." The kids giggled as Professor Spelunk accidentally dropped his flashlight. I'd been doing puppet shows since before I became a ranger. It started as a way to make extra money after Emma's father left us, but I discovered that kids listen better to safety rules when a silly puppet taught them. "The cave stays the same temperature all year round," I explained to the adults. 54 degrees, so you might want to zip up those jackets. We'll be down there about 3 hours, seeing some amazing rock formations and learning about the history of this place. What I didn't mention was the darker history. Mammoth Cave had been a stop on the Underground Railroad. Escaped slaves had hidden in these tunnels, sometimes for weeks. Some made it to freedom, others never made it out at all. As we approached the entrance, I noticed something odd. Usually, bats would flutter near the opening, but today there were none. Just silence. The air coming from the cave felt different too, not cooler like usual, but somehow thicker, like breathing through wet cloth. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Little." Sarah tugged on my jacket. "Why is it so quiet?" I looked around. She was right. No bird sounds, no wind through the trees. Even the kids had gotten quieter without realizing it. "Sometimes winter makes everything peaceful," I said, but something cold crawled up my spine. We entered the cave with our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The limestone walls sparkled in our lights, and the kids oohed and ahed at the formations. Everything seemed normal. I started my usual tour speech about how the cave was formed millions of years ago, pointing out flowstone and stalactites. But as we walked deeper, I noticed our footsteps sounded wrong. Usually, the cave echoed footsteps back clearly. Today, the echoes came back different, like more people were walking than actually were. "Stay close to me, everyone," I called out, trying to keep my voice cheerful. The cave can play tricks with sound. We stopped at Cathedral Hall, a huge chamber where I always did my first puppet show. I set up Professor Spelunk on my hand and started the safety routine. But as the puppet moved in my flashlight beam, its shadow on the wall looked wrong. Instead of mimicking the puppet's movements, the shadow seemed to move a split second later, like it was trying to catch up. "Look at that funny shadow," Tommy pointed at the wall. I turned to look and froze. The puppet's shadow was still there, but Professor Spelunk was back in my bag. I hadn't been holding him at all. "Just tricks of the light," I managed to say, but my hands were shaking as I pulled out my real flashlight to check the batteries. Full power. No reason for strange shadows. The temperature in the chamber felt different too. Not the usual steady 54 degrees, but somehow colder and warmer at the same time, like the air itself couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "Mom, I want to go back," Sarah whispered to Mrs. Morrison. "We just got here, sweetheart," her mother replied. but I could hear uncertainty in her voice. I looked at my watch. We'd been underground for 20 minutes. Outside, the first snowflakes of what would become the worst blizzard in years had started to fall. We moved deeper into the cave system, following the marked tourist trail. I'd walked this path thousands of times, but today it felt different. Longer. The usual landmarks seemed farther apart, and twice I found myself double-checking the trail markers to make sure we were going the right way. "This is the rotunda," I announced as we entered a circular chamber. Native Americans used this room for ceremonies hundreds of years ago, and later, during the Civil War, this was a hiding place for people seeking freedom. I always kept the Underground Railroad history simple for the kids, but today the words felt heavy in my mouth. The darkness beyond our flashlight beams seemed deeper, more alive somehow. "What's that?" Emma pointed to the far side of the chamber. I followed her gaze and saw what looked like a person standing in the shadows. My heart jumped, then settled as I realized it must be another tour group. "Hello there," I called out. "Park Service, you folks doing okay?" No answer. The figure didn't move. I told my group to wait and walked closer, flashlight raised. As the beam hit where the person should be, there was nothing there. Just empty cave wall. But on the limestone, clear as day, was a perfect shadow of a tall man in old-fashioned clothes. A shadow with no one to cast it. I backed away quickly, keeping my light on the wall. The shadow stayed put, burned into the rock like a stain. Around it, I noticed other marks. Scratches in the stone that looked almost like claw marks, but arranged in patterns. Deliberate patterns. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Mrs. Morrison called." "Everything all right?" "Just checking the trail markers," I lied, forcing my voice to stay steady. Sometimes other groups leave things behind. But as I rejoined my families, I counted heads twice. 12 families, 38 people total. I'd counted the same group going in. Now I kept getting 39. The extra shadow followed us. I noticed it first when we stopped at the Grand Gallery. While everyone marveled at the huge passage stretching into darkness, I saw our shadows on the wall. But there was one more than there should be. A tall figure that moved when none of us moved, stood when we all sat down for my next puppet show. "Professor Spelunk is going to tell us about cave formations," I announced, trying to focus on my job. But as I pulled out the puppet, something was wrong with my own shadow. It moved too slowly, like it was stuck in thick mud. Little Emma raised her hand. "Mom Cat, why is your shadow dancing?" I looked at the wall and my blood turned cold. My shadow was moving independently, gesturing and pointing while I stood perfectly still. Then, as I watched in horror, it began to move toward the other shadows of my tour group. "Everyone stay close," I said sharply. "We're moving to the next chamber." But as we walked, I heard whispers echoing from deeper in the cave. Voices speaking words I couldn't quite catch, but the tone was urgent, desperate, like people calling for help. "Did you hear that?" asked Mr. Morrison. "Just whined through the cave passages," I replied automatically. But there was no wind underground. There never was. The whispers got louder. Now I could make out words: "This way, safe passage, follow me." And then, impossibly, one voice rose above the others, clear and commanding. "Keep them together, conductor. Lead them to safety." Conductor. That's what they called the people who led slaves through the Underground Railroad. But everyone who had worked these caves during the Civil War was long dead. We reached the Methodist Church, another large chamber, and I decided to cut the tour short. Something was very wrong, and I needed to get these families back to the surface. "Folks, I'm afraid we need to head back," I started to say. But little Tommy Morrison screamed. He was pointing at the wall behind me. There, in perfect detail, were shadows of a dozen people in old-fashioned clothes. Men, women, children, all looking terrified, all reaching toward us with outstretched hands. But there was nobody there to cast those shadows. "It's okay," I said quickly, but my voice cracked. "Sometimes the limestone formations play tricks with our lights." That's when Mrs. Morrison grabbed my arm. "Cat, where's Jim?" "Jim?" "Jim's back at the visitor center." "No, the Jim who was with us. He joined our group in the last chamber." I stared at her. There had been no Jim with us. I'd counted heads carefully. But now, as I looked around our group, I could have sworn there had been someone else, a tall man in dark clothes who'd been walking at the back of our group. A man whose shadow I'd seen on the wall, but who wasn't actually there. We're leaving. Now, I said firmly. Everyone stay close, hold hands if you have to. Follow me, and don't look at the walls. But as we turned to go back the way we came, our flashlight beams revealed something impossible. The tunnel we'd entered through was gone. In its place was solid rock wall. We were trapped. And from somewhere deep in the darkness behind us came the sound of many footsteps, moving in perfect rhythm, like a group of people marching in formation. Getting closer. There has to be another way out, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was hammering. I'd been in these caves for 7 years. I knew every tunnel, every passage. There was always another way. But as we moved through the chamber, checking every opening with our flashlights, I found passages that shouldn't exist and others that had simply vanished. The cave was changing around us, rearranging itself like a living thing. Stay together, I called to the families. Caves can be confusing, but I know these tunnels better than anyone. That was a lie. I didn't know where we were anymore. The marching sounds were getting louder, echoing from multiple directions now, and underneath it I heard singing. Low, mournful voices singing what sounded like old spirituals. Songs that slaves might have sung while hiding in these very chambers. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Do you hear music? Asked Sarah, tugging on her mother's coat. Mrs. Morrison listened carefully. I think so. Where's it coming from? Before I could answer, Tommy Morrison pointed at the wall. Look, people. More shadows had appeared on the limestone walls. Not just a few this time, but dozens. Shadows of men, women, and children in old-fashioned clothes, moving in a long line like they were following a trail. Some carried bundles, others held children. All of them looked terrified and hopeful at the same time. And leading them was the shadow of a tall man in a conductor's hat. Underground Railroad, whispered Mr. Morrison, who taught history at the local high school. These caves were part of the Underground Railroad, but this is impossible. The shadow conductor turned toward us, and even though it was just a dark shape on the wall, I could feel it looking directly at me. Then it raised one arm and pointed deeper into the cave. This way, came a voice from everywhere and nowhere. Safe passage this way. Trust the conductor. No, I said firmly, we're not going anywhere. We're staying right here until. That's when I noticed our shadows on the opposite wall had started moving without us. My shadow stepped forward, even though I stood still. The shadows of the families began walking toward the wall where the shadow conductor waited. And as our shadows moved, I felt a horrible pulling sensation, like something was trying to drag my soul right out of my body. Fight it, I yelled. Don't let your shadows move. Think about staying in your own body. But little Emma was already walking forward, her eyes completely black, following her shadow toward the wall. Her real mother back at the babysitter's would never see her again if I didn't do something. I grabbed Emma's hand, and the moment I touched her, I felt what she felt. A powerful urge to follow the conductor, to trust him completely. He was going to take us somewhere safe, somewhere the bad people couldn't hurt us. We just had to follow our shadows into the wall. No. I shook Emma hard, and her eyes cleared. Stay with me, baby. Don't listen to the voice. But now half the families were walking toward the walls, following their shadows. Parents, children, grandparents, all with the same black eyes and peaceful expressions. I pulled out Professor Spelunk and made him dance frantically. Hey kids, look at me, Professor Spelunk needs your help. A few of the children turned away from the walls, giggling as the puppet made silly faces. But the adults kept walking, and their shadows were almost touching the conductor's shadow now. That's when I heard footsteps behind us. Real footsteps, not echoes. I turned and saw a man in a park ranger uniform walking toward us. He was tall and thin, with kind eyes and a familiar face. Thompson, I called out in relief. Thank God you found us. Cave rescue specialist Dave Thompson had trained me when I first started working at Mammoth Cave. If anyone could get us out of here, it was him. Cat, he said, but his voice sounded strange. Hollow. I've been looking everywhere for you. The entrance is blocked by snow, but I know another way out. Follow me. Something was wrong. Thompson was walking, but his feet made no sound on the cave floor. And in the light of our flashlights, I could see right through him. Dave, I said carefully. How did you get down here? The tunnel was blocked. He smiled, and his teeth were too white in the darkness. Same way our passengers got down here during the war, same way they're going to get out. Underground railroads still running, Cat. Still helping people find safety. Behind him, I could see the shadows of escaped slaves moving along the walls, following the path deeper into the cave. And our families were still walking toward them, drawn by their own shadows, like fish on hooks. This isn't the Underground Railroad, I said. This is something else. Thompson's face changed then, and I realized it wasn't really him at all. Whatever was wearing his appearance looked confused, almost hurt. But I help people, it said in a voice that echoed with pain and longing. I guide them to freedom. I saved so many during the war. Why won't these people trust me? The thing that looked like Thompson stepped closer, and I could smell something terrible, the scent of old earth and older fear. You have children with you. Children need protection. The world above is dangerous. Down here, they'll be safe forever. Safe forever meant dead. I realized that now. This thing had been leading people into the deepest parts of the cave for over a century, thinking it was helping them escape slavery. But slavery had ended. The war was over. And anyone who followed this shadow conductor would never see daylight again. I had to reach the families before their shadows pulled them completely into the walls. But as I stepped forward, my own shadow began moving again. And this time I felt the pulling much stronger. Like invisible hands grabbing at my soul, trying to tear me away from my body. Behind me, Emma started crying. Mom, Cat, I can't see you anymore. I turned around and saw the horrible truth. My shadow had moved so far from my body that I was becoming transparent, just like the thing pretending to be Thompson. If I lost my shadow completely, I'd become one of them. A conductor leading innocent people to their deaths, thinking I was saving them. The real fight was just beginning. I fought against the pull on my shadow, using every trick I'd learned in 7 years of cave safety. Focus on your breathing, stay grounded, don't panic. But this wasn't like being lost in a cave system. This was having my very self torn away piece by piece. Emma, I called out. Get my puppet bag, now. My daughter ran to where I'd dropped my supplies and pulled out all of Professor Spelunk's friends, Jenny the safety salamander, Bobby the bat, and Captain Carbide Light. Even as my shadow stretched further from my body, I knew what I had to do. The shadow conductor was still reaching toward our families, and half of them were almost at the wall where they would disappear forever. But this thing didn't understand what year it was. In its mind, it was still 1863, still helping escaped slaves find freedom. I had to teach it the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, I called out in my loudest tour guide voice, fighting to stay solid as my shadow pulled away. Today we're going to learn about the real Underground Railroad. I grabbed Professor Spelunk and made him bow to the shadow conductor. Hello there, Mr. Conductor. Professor Spelunk has some very important news for you. The shadow on the wall turned toward my puppet, and I felt the pulling sensation lessen slightly. It was listening. Tell me, Mr. Conductor. I made Professor Spelunk say, what year do you think it is? The shadow conductor's voice echoed from the walls. 1863. The war rages above. My passengers need safe passage to freedom. Oh my, said Professor Spelunk sadly. I'm afraid you've been down here a very long time. The war ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished. The people you're trying to help are free now. No, the voice said, full of pain and confusion. I can feel their fear. I can smell their desperation. They need me to guide them. That's not slaves you're sensing, I said, dropping the puppet voice and speaking directly. That's families on vacation, children learning about history. The fear you smell is their fear of you. The conductor's shadow seemed to waver, becoming less solid. But the children, they need protection. They need to go home to their own families, I said firmly. Look around you, really look. I turned to the families who were still conscious. Kids, can you help me show the conductor what year it is? Tell him about your homes, your schools, your toys. Tommy Morrison, still fighting the pull of his shadow, managed to speak. I go to Jefferson Elementary. My teacher is Mrs. Miller. We're learning about dinosaurs and space shuttles and computers. Space shuttles? The conductor's voice was uncertain now. Little Sarah added, "My dad works at a factory that makes cars. Mom says we might get a new Nintendo for Christmas." The shadows on the wall began to flicker and fade as the conductor struggled to understand. Cars, computers, Nintendo. These weren't words from his time. "But if the slaves are free," he said, his voice breaking with a century of pain, "then my mission, what have I been doing?" 2020, in 2020, the horrible truth was sinking in. For over 100 years, this spirit had been leading innocent people to their deaths, thinking he was saving them from slavery. Tour groups, researchers, spelunkers, anyone who reminded him of the desperate families he'd once helped escape. "You were trying to help," I said gently, even as I felt my shadow being pulled further away. "But the help isn't needed anymore. Your job is done. You can rest now." "No," the conductor's voice exploded through the cave, and suddenly all the shadows on the walls began moving frantically. Shadows of all his victims over the years, hundreds of people who had followed him into the deepest parts of the cave. "I can't leave them. I'm their conductor. I have to keep them safe." The families who were still conscious screamed as their shadows were yanked violently toward the walls. This time, there was no fighting it. I felt my own shadow tear completely away from my body, and suddenly I was standing beside the conductor, no longer solid, no longer alive. But I still had Professor Spelunk in my ghostly hands. "Mr. Conductor," the puppet said in my voice, "do you know what the best conductors do when they reach the end of the line?" The shadow conductor turned to me, his face finally becoming clear. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes full of terrible sadness. A man who had dedicated his life to helping others and had become trapped by his own good intentions. "They let their passengers go home," I said. Around us, the shadows of his century of victims began to move. Not toward the deep cave, but toward the surface, toward the light, toward freedom. "I don't know how to let go," the conductor whispered. "I'll teach you," I said. "But first, you have to let my families go back to their own lives. They have children who need them, homes to go to, futures to live." The conductor looked at the families pressed against the wall, then at the shadows of all the people he'd trapped over the years. His shoulders slumped as he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done. "I thought I was saving them," he said. "You were," I replied. "But now the best way to save them is to let them go." The conductor raised his hand, and one by one, our shadows snapped back to our bodies. The families gasped and stumbled, suddenly solid again. The tunnel that had vanished reappeared, leading back toward the surface. "Go," I told them. "Follow the trail markers, stay together, don't look back." As they stumbled toward the exit, Emma turned around. "Mom, Cat, come with us." I looked down at myself. I was still transparent, still caught between worlds. The conductor had let them go, but I had given up too much of myself to save them. "I'll be right behind you," I lied. "Go." As the families disappeared into the tunnel, the conductor and I stood alone in the chamber with the shadows of his century of victims. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked around at all the lost souls, then at the shadow of Professor Spelunk, still in my hands. "Now we finish the job. We help everyone find their way home." The conductor and I worked together through what felt like hours but might have been days. Underground, time moves differently. We guided the shadows of his victims, tourists from the 1,950 seconds, researchers from the 1,970 seconds, families from the 1,980 seconds, back through the cave system toward the light. Some had been trapped so long they'd forgotten they were dead. Others remembered their lives clearly and wept to finally be free. Each one thanked the conductor before dissolving into peaceful light, and each farewell made him a little more transparent, a little more ready to let go of his century-long vigil. "I can see the entrance," said the shadow of a little girl from 1,967. "I can see my mama waiting for me." As she faded into light, the conductor smiled for the first time since I'd met him. "She's safe now," he said. "They're all safe." When the last shadow had found peace, we stood alone in the empty chamber. The oppressive feeling that had haunted the cave was gone, replaced by something lighter, peaceful. "What about you?" the conductor asked me. "Don't you want to go home too?" I thought about Emma waiting at the babysitters, about my job, about all the families I still needed to teach about cave safety. "I do," I said. but I'm not sure how." The conductor smiled and held out his hand. "Trust the conductor," he said. "One last time." I took his hand, and suddenly we were standing at the cave entrance in the pale morning light. Snow covered everything in a thick white blanket, and I could see rescue vehicles and worried faces. The blizzard had passed. "Cat!" Emma ran toward me, solid and warm and completely alive. As she hugged me, I felt myself become real again, my shadow settling back where it belonged. "Where were you?" she cried. "Everyone's been looking for you." I looked around for the conductor, but he was gone. Only a faint shadow remained on the snow, already fading in the sunlight. The rescue teams found the tour families safe in the visitor center, confused and exhausted but unharmed. They all reported getting lost in the cave system and finding an alternate exit during the storm. None of them remembered the shadows or the conductor or anything supernatural. But their children did. Over the following weeks, I got calls from parents. Their kids were drawing pictures of underground shadows and asking questions about the Underground Railroad. They wanted to know more about the sad man who helped people and why he couldn't come home with them. I started a new educational program about the real Underground Railroad, teaching kids about the brave people who risked everything to help others find freedom. I told them about conductors like Harriet Tubman and the many unnamed heroes who guided escapes through places like Mammoth Cave. I never mentioned the shadow conductor directly, but somehow the children understood that his story was part of the larger story. That sometimes people who try to help can get lost in their mission, and sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to let go. The cave system was closed for geological surveys for 3 months. When it reopened, new safety protocols were in place, and tours stayed strictly to the most well-traveled passages. The deeper chambers where we'd encountered the conductor were sealed off permanently, but sometimes, late at night when I'm giving the last tour of the day, I catch glimpses of shadows that move independently of their sources. Not threatening shadows, just reminders that some stories don't end, they just find new ways to continue. Emma still comes on my tours sometimes, and she always brings Professor Spelunk with her. The kids love when she helps with the puppet shows, especially the new one we developed about helping lost travelers find their way home. And every December, when families come for our holiday programs, I make sure to tell them the most important cave safety rule of all. Stick together, follow the marked paths, and remember that the best way to help someone is sometimes simply to listen to what they really need. The conductor taught me that. In the end, what he needed wasn't to keep saving people. It was to know that his work had mattered, that freedom had been won, and that it was okay to rest. Sometimes I wonder if there are other conductors out there, in other caves and forgotten places, still trying to lead people to safety long after the danger has passed. I hope they find their way home eventually. I hope they all find peace. But just in case they don't, I keep my puppet bag ready and my flashlight charged. Because you never know when someone might need a good storyteller to help them understand that their journey is finally over. The cave keeps its secrets, but some secrets are meant to be shared. Some shadows need light to find their rest. And some conductors need to learn that the most important stop on any railroad is the one where passengers get to go home. My name is Samuel Ravencrest, but everyone calls me Sam. I've been a park ranger in North Carolina's Nantahala National Forest for 18 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, flash floods, even the occasional meth lab hidden in the deep woods. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened during the spring of 1989. I'm 41 years old, part Cherokee on my grandmother's side, and I know these mountains like the lines on my weathered hands. My specialty is water rescue, which means when the Nantahala River gets angry, I'm the guy they call. It's dangerous work, but somebody has to do it. The river claims lives every year, mostly tourists who think they can handle Class V rapids without proper training. That April started like any other spring in the gorge. The snowmelt from the higher peaks was heavy that year, the heaviest I'd ever seen. The river was running 15 feet above normal, turning what was usually a challenging but manageable stretch of whitewater into a churning monster. The old Cherokee called this kind of flood blood water, though I never understood why until later. I was living alone then. My ex-wife had taken the twins to Asheville after our divorce, and I only saw my daughters on weekends. The isolation didn't bother me much, or so I told myself. The ranger station sat on a bluff overlooking the gorge, connected to the outside world by a single mountain road that turned into soup whenever it rained hard. The gorge itself is something to see. Picture a narrow canyon carved through solid rock over millions of years, with the Nantahala River rushing through the bottom like a liquid highway. During normal water levels, it's beautiful crystal-clear water tumbling over granite boulders, surrounded by thick forest that stays green year-round thanks to the constant mist. But when the spring floods come, it becomes a different animal entirely. That morning, I was checking my gear when the radio crackled to life. A group of experienced rafting guides had gone out the day before to assess flood conditions for the upcoming tourist season. 8 men, all with years of experience on the river. They should have been back by sunset, but their trucks were still parked at the put-in, keys inside, personal belongings untouched. I grabbed my rescue kit and headed down to the river. The sound hit me first, a constant roar that seemed to shake the very ground. The water was the color of chocolate milk, carrying whole trees like they were twigs. Foam and spray filled the air so thick I could barely see across to the other side. That's when I found their rafts. All 4 boats were pulled up on shore in perfect condition, arranged in a neat pattern that made my skin crawl. Not random, not scattered by the current, arranged. In a circle, with their bows pointing toward an area where the flood had washed away the riverbank, exposing what looked like old stone foundations. I'd been on this river for nearly 2 decades, and I'd never seen those stones before. The water level had dropped slightly overnight, revealing carved symbols that looked Cherokee but older somehow, deeper. The exposed earth around them was dark red, like rust stains, and had a sharp metallic smell that cut through the river's usual earthy scent. My radio buzzed. "Sam, this is dispatch. State Water Rescue is en route to assist." I clicked the handset. "Copy that. But tell them to be careful. Something doesn't feel right down here. I've always trusted my instincts on the river. Water has moods, patterns, behaviors you learn to read if you spend enough time with it. This water felt angry. Not just wild or dangerous, angry, like it was holding a grudge. As I walked around the arranged rafts, looking for any sign of the missing guides, a fish flopped at my feet. That wasn't unusual near a flooding river, except this fish was 20 feet from the water's edge and somehow wedged inside the split trunk of an old oak tree. A trout, gasping and silver, 15 feet off the ground. That was impossible. But there it was. The mist from the rapids started getting thicker, turning the world gray and close. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet in any direction. The constant roar of water began to sound different too, like voices talking all at once in a language I almost recognized but couldn't quite understand. I reached for my radio to call for more help, but stopped when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Singing. Faint but distinct, coming from somewhere downriver. A Cherokee death song, one my grandmother used to hum when she thought no one was listening, but there was nobody else in the gorge. Nobody alive, anyway. The state rescue team arrived 2 hours later, 3 experienced swiftwater technicians, led by a guy named Martinez, who had a reputation for pulling people out of impossible situations. We met at the ranger station while rain started falling again, turning the world into a gray curtain of water. "Show me where you found the rafts," Martinez said, checking his gear with the quick efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. I led them down the muddy trail to the riverside. The mist had gotten worse, thick as cotton and carrying that metallic smell I couldn't shake. When we reached the spot where I'd found the boats, Martinez stopped short. "Jesus," he whispered. "They arranged these?" "That's what I thought," I said. "But why would experienced guides do something like that?" "They wouldn't." Martinez knelt beside one of the rafts, running his hand along the rubber. "Look at this, Sam. You see how the rope is coiled? Perfect spirals, every one identical. This isn't how guys store gear after a panic situation." His teammate, a young woman named Torres, was examining the exposed stone foundations. "These carvings," she called out, "they look old, really old." I walked over to see what she was looking at. The symbols carved into the stone were definitely Cherokee, but in a style I'd never seen before. My grandmother had taught me some of the old writing, but these markings seemed deeper, more primal. They hurt to look at for too long. "My grandmother called this area sacred," I said. "Something about water spirits." I always figured it was just stories to keep kids away from the dangerous rapids. Looks like somebody's been digging here recently, Torres observed, pointing to fresh scratches around the stones. See these tool marks? That's when we heard the splash. Not a normal water sound, this was heavy, deliberate, like something large had just entered the river upstream. We all turned toward the sound, but the mist was too thick to see more than a few yards. "Hello," Martinez called out. "Rescue team, if anyone can hear us, make some noise." The response came immediately, a voice calling back from somewhere in the mist, weak, desperate. "Help, help us." "There," Torres pointed toward the voice. "Someone's in the water." We moved quickly along the bank, following the sound. The voice kept calling, always just ahead of us in the mist, but something was wrong with it. The words were English, but the rhythm was off, like someone speaking a foreign language and trying to copy sounds they didn't understand. "Help, please. Keep talking," Martinez shouted back. "We're coming." That's when I realized what was bothering me. The voice wasn't moving. In a river running this fast, anything in the water should be swept downstream in seconds. But the calls were coming from the exact same spot, as if someone was standing still in 25-mile-per-hour current. "Wait," I said, grabbing Martinez's arm. "Something's not right." The voice called again, closer now. "Help. Us." "Sam?" My blood turned to ice water. The voice knew my name. "How does he know your name?" Torres whispered. I didn't answer because I couldn't. We hadn't announced ourselves, and I wasn't wearing any name tags. But somehow, something in that mist knew exactly who I was. The fog shifted, and for just a moment, we saw him. A man was standing waist-deep in the raging current, arms outstretched toward us. But he wasn't fighting the water, he was perfectly still, like he was standing on solid ground instead of in a flood that should have swept him away instantly. His clothes were dark, plastered to his body, and his face was wrong. The features were human, but arranged slightly off, like a photograph that had been torn up and put back together by someone who had never seen a person before. And his eyes weren't looking at us, they were looking through us, focusing on something behind us we couldn't see. "Jesus Christ," Martinez breathed. The figure raised one arm, pointing directly at me, and opened its mouth. Water poured out instead of words, not like someone drowning, but like a pitcher being emptied. A steady stream of river water that went on far too long. Then the mist closed around it again, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" Torres asked, her voice shaking. "Did we all see that?" Before anyone could answer, she screamed. Something had grabbed her ankle from the water. She was being pulled toward the river by hands we couldn't see, sliding down the muddy bank despite Martinez's desperate grip on her arms. I dove for her other leg, feeling the mud give way under my boots. For a few seconds, we had her, but whatever was pulling had incredible strength, not just strong, but impossibly strong. Torres was being dragged into the current by something that could overcome 3 grown adults working together. "The knife!" Martinez yelled. "Cut whatever's holding her." I fumbled for my rescue knife, but before I could reach it, Torres disappeared under the brown water with a sound I'll never forget. Half scream, half gurgle, suddenly cut off. The 3 of us who were left stared at the water where she'd vanished. The river kept roaring, indifferent to what had just happened. But now I could swear I heard laughter mixed in with the sound of the current. Low, bubbling laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We called for backup immediately, but the mountain roads were washing out faster than crews could clear them. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally hit with full force, turning the trail back to the ranger station into a muddy waterslide. We were trapped in the gorge until the weather cleared. Martinez and his remaining teammate, a quiet guy named Peterson, set up their equipment on higher ground while I tried to raise anyone on the radio. Static filled the airwaves, broken occasionally by fragments of voices speaking in that same strange rhythm we'd heard from the figure in the mist. "Sam," Martinez called from where he was assembling a throw rope system. "You need to see this." I splashed through ankle-deep water to where he stood. He was pointing at the river, where something large was moving just under the surface. Not fighting the current like debris would, but moving deliberately upstream against the flow. "What do you think it is?" Peterson asked. Before I could answer, the thing breached the surface. It was Torres, or what had been Torres. She floated upright in the water, her rescue gear still intact, her eyes wide open and staring directly at us. But she wasn't breathing, wasn't struggling, wasn't doing anything human beings do when they're drowning. She was just standing there in the middle of a raging flood, perfectly balanced, perfectly still. "Torres!" Martinez shouted. "Can you hear me?" Her mouth opened, and that same stream of water poured out, along with words that weren't quite right. "Come into the water, Sam." This time, she was definitely talking to me specifically. "Why does it keep using your name?" Peterson whispered. I was starting to get an idea about that, and I didn't like it one bit. My grandmother's stories weren't just bedtime tales to keep kids away from the river. They were warnings about something real. Something that had been sleeping under these waters for a very long time. The exposed stone foundations weren't Cherokee construction sites. They were graves. And the recent excavation marks Torres had noticed meant someone had been digging in a place that should never be disturbed. As if responding to my thoughts, more figures began emerging from the water. All the missing rafting guides, standing in perfect formation across the width of the river. 8 experienced outdoorsmen, all floating upright in impossible currents, all staring at me with those wrong, water-filled eyes. "This is impossible," Martinez muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. After what we'd seen, impossible was becoming relative. The figures began to move, wading through the flood toward shore with slow, deliberate steps. The water seemed to part around them, flowing around their bodies, instead of carrying them away. As they got closer, I could see they weren't quite right either. Their proportions were slightly off, like their bones had been rearranged by something that understood human anatomy but had never been human itself. "We need to get out of here," Peterson said, backing toward higher ground. "Right now." But, as we turned to climb back up the muddy slope, we found our path blocked. More figures were emerging from the forest people I'd seen around the area over the years. Hikers who had disappeared, fishermen who never came home, even a few faces I recognized from missing person reports going back decades. All of them dripping wet despite being nowhere near the water. All of them staring at me with that same focused intensity. The circle of figures closed around us, leaving us standing in a small clearing with the river on one side and the wrong-looking people on the other. They weren't threatening us exactly, they were just standing there, waiting for something. That's when I heard the sound that explained everything. Deep underwater, something massive was moving. The river itself seemed to be shifting, changing course, flowing uphill in some places and standing completely still in others. The sound was like an enormous heartbeat, slow and powerful, coming from somewhere far below the surface. Whatever was down there was waking up. "Sam," Martinez whispered, "what the hell is happening here?" I was remembering my grandmother's words about the Nvisahi, the water spirit that guards the boundary between the living and the dead. According to the old stories, it only wakes when sacred burial sites are disturbed, and it doesn't go back to sleep until the balance is restored. The figures around us began to speak in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. They were chanting in Cherokee, words I recognized from funeral ceremonies. They were singing the dead home. The river began to glow with a deep red light, and I realized why the Cherokee called floodwater bloodwater. It wasn't just a description of the muddy color. It was a warning about what the water becomes when the spirits wake up angry. In the center of the glowing river, something huge was rising from the depths. Dark water shaped itself into the outline of a man, but a man 50 feet tall with eyes like whirlpools and a voice like thunder. The Nvisahi had come to collect what was owed. And apparently, what was owed included me. The water spirit rose from the river like a living tsunami, towering over us with a presence that made the air itself feel heavy. Its voice, when it spoke, came from everywhere at once, the rapids, the rain, even the moisture in our lungs. "Samuel Ravencrest," it said, pronouncing my name with perfect Cherokee inflection. "Descendant of the people, you know why I wake." The figures surrounding us, Torres, the missing rafters, all the others turned their attention to the massive spirit as if waiting for orders. But their eyes kept drifting back to me, and I was beginning to understand why. "The graves," I said, my voice barely audible over the roar of displaced water. "Someone disturbed the burial ground." "Your people," the spirit replied. "They dug where they should not dig. They took what should not be taken. The balance is broken." Martinez grabbed my arm. "What's it talking about? What people?" I closed my eyes, remembering conversations with my ex-wife about selling some of our land near the river to developers. Property that included areas my grandmother had always insisted were sacred, land where new vacation cabins were being built right now, with foundations that required deep excavation into ground that hadn't been touched for centuries. The construction project, I whispered. They're building right on top of the burial sites. The water spirit's form shifted, becoming more solid, more defined. I could see Cherokee burial ornaments incorporated into its shape, pottery shards, carved bones, ceremonial stones that had been scattered by bulldozers and buried under concrete. The dead cannot rest while their bones lie beneath the homes of strangers, the spirit said. They call to me from beneath wood and stone. They demand justice. But why these people? I gestured toward the circle of wrong-looking figures. They didn't disturb anything. The water claims what the water needs, it replied. Souls to replace souls, life to balance life. Until the graves are restored, the river keeps what it takes. That's when I understood the true horror of our situation. The spirit wasn't randomly killing people, it was collecting souls to stand guard over the disturbed graves until they could be properly restored. Taurus, the rafters, all the missing people, over the years they were being held in a kind of supernatural custody, kept between life and death until the spiritual balance could be fixed. And I was the key to fixing it. You carry the blood, the spirit said, its massive face turning toward me. You speak for the people. You can restore what was broken. How? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Return the bones to sacred ground. Speak the words of restoration. Accept the responsibility of guardian. The alternative, though unspoken, was clear. If I couldn't or wouldn't fix the situation, the spirit would keep taking souls. The river would claim every person who entered its domain until someone made things right. But there was a problem. The construction project was owned by a development company with contracts worth millions of dollars. Even if I could prove the area was a sacred burial ground, legal battles could take years. And in the meantime, more people would disappear into the water. Unless I found another way. I looked at the figures surrounding us, dozens of people held in limbo between life and death. Then I looked at Martinez and Peterson, who were staring at the massive water spirit with expressions of pure terror. There's another option, I said to the spirit, a temporary solution. Its whirlpool eyes focused on me with crushing intensity. The graves need guardians until they can be properly restored. I continued. What if I stayed? What if I took responsibility for protecting this place until the legal issues are resolved? Sam, what are you saying? Martinez whispered. I was saying that sometimes the only way to save everyone else is to sacrifice yourself. But I was also thinking about my daughters, growing up without their father, thinking about all the people who would die if this situation continued. A willing guardian, the spirit mused. One who chooses the responsibility. This would satisfy the balance. But only temporarily, I insisted, until the graves can be properly restored and protected by law. The massive figure was silent for a long moment, and I could feel it weighing my offer against its ancient obligations. Finally, it nodded. The willing guardian may speak for the dead. But if you fail in your duty, if the graves remain disturbed, you join the others in the water. I looked at Martinez and Peterson. Get out of here, both of you. Tell them the area is too dangerous for rescue operations until further notice. We're not leaving you, Martinez said. Yes, you are, I replied. Because if you don't, you'll end up like Torres and the others, and then no one will know what really happened here. The spirit raised one massive arm, and the river began to recede. The figures around us, all the captured souls, started walking back toward the water with slow, mechanical movements. The guardian chooses, the spirit said. The compact is sealed. As the water spirit dissolved back into the river, taking the captured souls with it, I felt a change come over me. Not physical exactly, but something deeper. I could sense every drop of water in the gorge, feel the exact location of the disturbed graves, understand the weight of spiritual responsibility that came with protecting this place. Martinez and Peterson climbed out of the gorge that afternoon, carrying word that the rescue operation had been suspended due to dangerous conditions. The official report listed Torres and the missing rafters as flood victims, their bodies swept away by unprecedented currents. But I knew better. They were sleeping now, held safe by the spirit, until I could find a way to restore the graves properly. It might take months, maybe years of legal battles with developers and government agencies, but I had time. After all, I wasn't going anywhere. That was 6 months ago. The legal battle is still ongoing, but I'm making progress. Turns out that having a Cherokee Ranger with documented evidence of sacred burial grounds carries more weight than the developers expected. The construction has been suspended pending a full archaeological survey, and there's growing public support for preserving the area as protected tribal land. My daughters visit me at the ranger station every weekend now. They think I've become more dedicated to my job, more connected to our Cherokee heritage. They're not wrong, though they don't understand the full truth. My ex-wife says I seem more at peace, more centered. She's thinking about moving back to the area. I've learned to work with the NV High Isahi rather than fear it. The spirit doesn't communicate in words anymore. It's more like an understanding that flows through the water itself. It knows I'm keeping my end of the bargain, working to restore the sacred sites and protect them from future disturbance. The missing people are still out there, held in a state between life and death. I see them sometimes when the water is particularly still, standing beneath the surface, like sentinels. Torres waves at me occasionally, and I wave back. They're not suffering, they're just waiting. Other rangers ask me why I never leave the gorge anymore, why I seem to know things about the river that aren't in any manual. I tell them it comes from experience, from spending enough time in one place that you become part of it. That's true, as far as it goes. What I don't tell them is that I can feel every person who enters the river now. I know when someone's in trouble before they call for help, can sense when the water is feeling particularly angry or restless. I've prevented 3 drownings and 2 equipment failures in the past 6 months, always knowing exactly where to be and when. The tourists and rafting guides think I'm just exceptionally good at my job. They have no idea that the river itself is keeping me informed. Sometimes, late at night when the water is running quiet, I hear the Cherokee death songs again. But now I understand they're not songs of mourning, they're songs of patience. The spirits are waiting for justice, and they trust me to deliver it. I will deliver it, however long it takes. The blood tide still rises every spring when the snowmelt comes down from the peaks, but now it runs clear instead of red, because the balance is being maintained. The NVIISAHI sleeps peacefully in the depths, knowing that the sacred places have a guardian again. And if sometimes I feel the pull of the water, the invitation to join the others in their patient vigil beneath the surface, well, that's a small price to pay for keeping the peace between the world of the living and the world of the dead. My name is Samuel Ravencrest, and I am the guardian of Raven's Gorge, at least until the graves can go home where they belong. Asterisk. The water remembers everything. And now, so do I. My name is Benjamin Stormwright, but everyone calls me Ben. I've been a park ranger for 14 years now, working the Lookout Mountain area where Georgia meets Tennessee. Before this job, I was a psychology professor, studying memory disorders and trauma. Seemed like important work back then. Now I'm not so sure. I took this ranger job after coming back from Vietnam. The nightmares were bad, and the classroom felt too small, too closed in. Out here in the mountains, with all this space and quiet, I could breathe again. Or so I thought. It was November 1995, right around the anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga. That's a Civil War battle that happened here in 1863. Lots of folks don't know this, but Chickamauga had more soldiers go crazy than any other battle in the war. They called it Soldier's Heart back then. Now we call it PTSD. I should know, I have it myself. The weather had been strange all week. Fog kept rolling in at weird times, thick and heavy like soup. It didn't move right either. Normal fog follows the wind and the valleys. This fog just sat there, like it was waiting for something. I was sitting in my observation post, about 30 miles from the nearest town, writing my daily report when the radio crackled to life. "Ben, you there?" It was Sheriff Martinez from down in the valley. "I'm here, Maria. What's up? Got a weird one for you. Remember those Civil War reenactors who were supposed to do a practice battle yesterday?" I did remember. A group of about 12 men who liked to dress up in old uniforms and pretend to fight the war again seemed harmless enough, though I never understood the appeal. Yeah, what about them? We found them this morning, wandering around the Walmart parking lot in full uniform. Thing is, Ben, they don't remember who they are. That got my attention fast. I put down my pen and leaned closer to the radio. What do you mean? I mean, they think it's 1,863. They're talking like they just fought in the real battle. They don't know what cars are. One of them asked me if I was a Union spy because of my uniform. Another one keeps asking for his wife Sarah, but his wife's name is Linda, and she died 2 years ago. A chill ran down my back that had nothing to do with the November air. Are they hurt? No injuries we can see, but they're terrified. Keep talking about cannon fire and friends getting shot. Ben, I've known most of these guys for years. Tom Bradley runs the hardware store. Jim Chen teaches at the high school. They're not crazy, but right now they think they're Confederate soldiers. I looked out my window at the fog bank sitting heavy over the battlefield below. It hadn't moved in hours, which wasn't natural. Fog moves. Always. I'll be down in an hour, I said. Be careful driving in this fog, Ben. Can't see more than 10 feet. The drive down the mountain should have taken 40 minutes. It took me 2 hours. The fog was so thick I had to get out and walk in front of my truck several times just to find the road. And there was something else, a smell in the air that shouldn't have been there. Gunpowder. Sharp and bitter, like fireworks, but stronger. When I finally made it to town, I found the reenactors in the sheriff's office. They were still in their gray uniforms, sitting on benches like prisoners. But they weren't acting like the middle-aged hobbyists I knew. They sat straight, eyes alert, hands moving to where swords would hang. They looked like real soldiers. Tom Bradley, except he said his name was Private Thomas Braxton now, stared at me with eyes I didn't recognize. You're not wearing blue, he said. Are you with us? Tom, it's me, Ben Stormwright. I'm the ranger up on Lookout Mountain. He blinked slowly. I don't know any rangers, sir. Are you an officer? Sheriff Martinez pulled me aside. It's been like this all morning. They remember the battle perfectly. Who shot who, which units charged where, even details that aren't in any history book. But ask them about their real lives and they just look confused. Have you called a doctor? Doc Peterson checked them out. Physically, they're fine. But Ben, there's something else. She led me to her desk and picked up a plastic bag. Inside was a small piece of metal. We found this in Jim Chen's pocket. It's a musket ball, still warm. I stared at the bag. Musket balls were round lead bullets used in the Civil War. They hadn't been used in war for over 100 years. Where would he get this? That's what I want to know. And Ben? There's more. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out another bag. This one held a piece of cloth. This was in Tom's hand. It's torn from a Union soldier's uniform. Fresh tear. The cloth was blue wool, military issue. It looked new, like it had just been ripped off someone's jacket. But the Union Army stopped wearing these uniforms in 1865. Maria, I need to get back up to the mountain. Something's not right up there. What do you think is happening? I looked back at the men on the bench. They were talking quietly among themselves, and I could hear what they were saying. They were discussing battle plans and worrying about friends who had died in 1863. Men they couldn't have known. I don't know yet, I told her, but I think it has something to do with that fog. As I drove back up the mountain, the fog seemed to follow me. In my rearview mirror, I could see it rolling uphill behind my truck, moving against gravity and wind. That's when I first started to think that maybe, just maybe, the battlefield itself was trying to tell us something. And maybe it had been trying for a very long time. The fog followed me all the way back to the ranger station, but when I got out of my truck, something was different. The air smelled like a hospital. That sharp, clean smell of ether they used for surgery, mixed with the gunpowder. Smell, it made my stomach turn. I'd barely gotten inside when my radio crackled again. This time it wasn't Sheriff Martinez. Ben? Ben, are you there? This is Dr. Sarah Davis. Dr. Davis was a military historian from the university. She'd been coming to Chickamauga for years, studying the battle records. I'd met her a few times, smart woman, knew more about the Civil War than anyone I'd ever talked to. I'm here, Sarah. Where are you? I'm down at the visitor center. But Ben, something's wrong. Really wrong. I came up to do research, but the battlefield, it's different. Different how? There are fresh wounds on the trees, bullet holes that weren't there yesterday. And Ben, I can hear them. My hand tightened on the radio. Hear who? The soldiers. They're fighting the battle again, right now. I looked out my window toward the battlefield. The fog was so thick I couldn't see anything. But now that I was listening, I could hear it too. Distant shouting, the crack of rifles. And underneath it all, a sound that made my blood run cold, men screaming. Sarah, get out of there, come up to my station. I can't, my car won't start. And Ben? I think I'm starting to remember things. Things that didn't happen to me. What kind of things? Loading a cannon. The smell of black powder on my hands. A boy from Tennessee who died next to me. But I'm a woman, Ben. Women weren't in this battle. The radio went quiet for a long moment, then came back full of static. Ben, my head feels strange, like there's someone else in here with me. Someone who knows how to fire a musket. Someone who remembers dying here. Sarah, listen to me. Fight it. Remember who you are. You're Dr. Sarah Davis. You teach history. You drive a blue Honda Civic. Blue Honda. No, I ride a horse. A mare named Belle. My unit is the 15th Alabama Infantry. We're supposed to hold this hill until... The radio went dead. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the fog. The visitor center was only half a mile down the trail, but in this fog it might as well have been on the moon. Every step felt like walking into cotton, and the sounds of battle were getting louder. As I walked, I started seeing things in the fog. Shadows moving wrong, too tall or too short to be trees. Once, I could swear I saw the outline of a man in uniform running past me, but when I turned my flashlight that way, nothing was there. The worst part was the ground. It felt wrong under my feet. Soft in places where it should be hard, like the earth was fresh turned, like there were new graves. I found Dr. Davis sitting on a bench outside the visitor center. She was staring straight ahead into the fog, and when I got closer, I could see she was crying. Sarah? She looked up at me, and her eyes were different. Older. Sadder. Yankee, she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. Are you here to surrender? Sarah, it's Ben, the park ranger. You called me on the radio. She blinked slowly, and for a moment her normal expression came back. Ben? Oh God, Ben, there's someone else in my head. He's so scared. He's just a boy, really. 19 years old. He's from a farm in Alabama, and he misses his mother. Then her face changed again, became someone else. I want to go home, she said in a young man's voice. I want to see Mama again. We shouldn't have come here. This place is cursed. Who are you? I asked, feeling ridiculous for talking to whatever was speaking through Sarah. Private Johnny Whitman, 15th Alabama. Sir, I think I'm dying. There's blood everywhere, and I can't feel my legs. I looked down. Sarah's legs were fine, but she was looking at them like they were covered in blood. Blood I couldn't see. Johnny, you're not dying. This is 1,995, not 1,863. The battle is over. Over? The voice sounded confused. But we were just... The Yankees were charging our line. Captain Morrison told us to hold our ground. The battle ended a long time ago, Johnny. You can rest now. Sarah's body relaxed for a moment, and when she looked at me again, it was with her own eyes. He's gone, she whispered. But Ben, there are more of them, hundreds of them. They're all here, all the soldiers who died. They're trying to find bodies to finish the battle in. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy boots, on soft ground, coming closer through the fog. Too many boots, like a whole company of soldiers marching. We need to get out of here, I said, helping Sarah to her feet. But as we turned to leave, the footsteps stopped. And in the silence, a new voice called out from the fog. An officer's voice, used to giving commands. Halt! Who goes there? I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. Behind us, I could hear the voice calling orders to troops that shouldn't exist. Form ranks, prepare to advance, fix bayonets. We made it about 50 yards before Sarah collapsed. When I helped her up, she was laughing, but it wasn't her laugh. It was too deep, too rough. You can't run from us, she said, in yet another voice. This is our ground. We died for this ground. And now we're taking it back. I realized then that we weren't just dealing with confused reenactors anymore. Something was happening here that I didn't understand. Something that had been building for 132 years, ever since the battle ended. And I was starting to think that maybe the battle had never really ended at all. By the time I got Sarah back to my station, she was switching between 3 different personalities. There was Dr. Sarah Davis, the historian who knew it was 1995. There was Private Johnny Whitman from Alabama, who wanted to go home to his mother. And there was someone new, Sergeant William Hayes from Ohio, who kept asking about his unit and giving military orders to people who weren't there. I tried to call for help, but my radio was picking up strange signals. Instead of the sheriff's office, I kept hearing what sounded like Civil War-era military communications. Orders being shouted, reports of casualties, requests for ammunition, all in voices that crackled like old recordings, but with the urgency of real-time battle reports. "Sarah, can you hear me?" I asked during one of her lucid moments. "I'm here, but they're getting stronger, Ben. It's like they're feeding off being close to the battlefield, and there are more coming. I can feel them pressing against my mind, all these dead soldiers who want another chance." She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have to understand, they didn't die clean deaths. They were boys, most of them. They died scared and confused and far from home. They never got to say goodbye. They never got to finish what they started. What do they want? To complete the battle, to finish dying properly, but they need living minds to do it." That's when we heard the car coming up the mountain road. Through the fog, I could see headlights moving slowly, like the driver couldn't see where they were going. It was another historian, Dr. Marcus Webb, who worked with Sarah at the university. He stumbled out of his car looking confused and frightened. "Ben, Sarah, what's happening up here?" I was driving up for our research meeting, but I kept getting lost. The road signs keep changing, and I keep thinking I'm supposed to be somewhere else, doing something important. Sarah looked at him with eyes that weren't her own. "Marcus, you need to leave, now." But it was too late. As Marcus stepped closer to the station, his face went blank for a moment, then filled with an expression I'd never seen on him before. When he spoke, his voice had a slight southern accent he'd never had. "Captain Davis, is that you, sir? I thought you were killed in the charge." Sarah stood up straighter, and when she answered, her voice was different too, commanding, like an officer. "Lieutenant Webb, good to see you made it through. What's the status of our line?" "We're holding, sir, but barely. The Yankees have been hitting us hard all morning. We're running low on ammunition." I watched in horror as 2 university professors started having a conversation, as if they were Civil War officers in the middle of battle. They were talking about troop movements and casualty reports for events that happened over a century ago. "This isn't real," I said loudly. "You're Dr. Sarah Davis and Dr. Marcus Webb. You're historians. It's 1995. They both turned to look at me, and for a moment I saw confusion in their eyes. Then Marcus blinked and was himself again. What just happened?" "Ben," I felt like someone else was talking through me. Someone who knew about military tactics I've never studied, but Sarah was still gone, still being Captain Davis. "Who is this civilian?" she asked Marcus. "Does he have clearance to be in this area?" Marcus looked terrified. "Sarah, snap out of it. It's me, Marcus. We work together." That's when the real horror started. The fog outside began to glow with a pale, sick light. Through the windows, I could see shapes moving. Lots of them. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. Some were too tall, others seemed to be missing parts. And they were all wearing uniforms. "Company, form ranks," Sarah shouted in her officer voice. "Prepare to receive cavalry." The shapes in the fog responded to her command. They began forming into organized lines, like real soldiers following orders. But these weren't real soldiers. These were something else, something that had been waiting in the fog for 132 years. Marcus grabbed my arm. "Ben, we have to get out of here. Sarah's calling them up somehow. She's giving orders to the dead." But when we tried to leave, we found the door wouldn't open, not because it was stuck, but because every time we touched the handle, our hands would freeze, and we'd forget what we were trying to do. Like the station itself didn't want us to leave. "Forward march," Sarah commanded, and through the window I could see the ghostly army beginning to move. They were marching straight toward us. Marcus collapsed into a chair, his face pale. I can feel them trying to get into my head. There's a Confederate major named Peterson who wants to use my body to lead a charge. He's showing me memories of his home in Virginia, his wife, his children, God, Ben. He misses them so much. Fight it, I told him, but I could feel something pressing at my own mind too. A Union corporal named Tom Sullivan who was angry about dying so far from Boston. He wanted to finish the fight, to make the rebels pay for killing his friends. The temperature in the station dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Our breath came out in clouds, and frost began forming on the windows. Through the frost, I could see the dead army getting closer. Sarah spun around to face us, but her eyes were completely different now, older, colder, filled with the authority of someone who'd commanded men in battle. "Gentlemen," she said in a voice that belonged to someone who died in 1863, "welcome to the Battle of Chickamauga. You have the honor of serving in the final assault, the one that will settle this war once and for all." Marcus stood up, but it wasn't Marcus anymore. His whole posture had changed, become military and formal. "Yes, sir, my men are ready." I realized with growing terror that I was the only one left who remembered the real world. Sarah and Marcus were gone, replaced by dead officers who thought they were still fighting the Civil War. And outside, an army of ghosts was preparing to use our bodies to finish a battle that should have ended 132 years ago. The ghost army reached my station just as the fog turned blood red. Through the windows, I could see them clearly now. Hundreds of Confederate and Union soldiers, some missing arms, others with holes blown through their chests, all of them staring at us with hungry, desperate eyes. They wanted in, they wanted bodies, they wanted to finish dying. Sarah, still possessed by the Confederate captain, walked to the door and opened it wide. "Come in, boys, time to settle this properly." The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs as the dead soldiers began filing into the station. They moved through the walls like smoke, but once inside, they looked almost solid, almost alive. That's when I understood what was really happening. These weren't just random ghosts. They were the psychological casualties from Chickamauga. The soldiers who'd broken under the stress of battle, who'd lost their minds before they lost their lives. They'd been trapped here ever since, reliving their trauma over and over, trying to make sense of what happened to them. "You're suffering from soldier's heart?" I said to the room full of dead men. "What we call PTSD now. You never got treatment. You never got to heal." A young Confederate soldier, maybe 19 years old, turned to look at me. "Treatment? Sir, I don't understand. You're all traumatized. The battle broke your minds, and when you died, you stayed broken. That's why you can't move on." The Union corporal who'd been trying to possess me stepped closer. "Mister, we died fighting for our country. We died doing our duty." "No," I said, my psychology training finally clicking into place. "You died scared and confused and far from home. You died thinking you failed. You've been carrying that trauma for 132 years. Marcus, still possessed by the Confederate major, laughed bitterly. "What would a civilian know about war?" "I'm a veteran," I said, "Vietnam, and I know what it's like to come home from war with your head full of ghosts." That stopped them. For the first time since the possession started, the dead soldiers looked uncertain. I pressed on. "The difference is, I got help. I learned that trauma isn't failure. It's injury, and injuries can heal if you treat them right." "How?" The young Confederate soldier's voice was barely a whisper. "How do you heal from dying?" "By understanding that dying isn't the end of the story. By dealing with the guilt and fear and confusion you carried when you passed. By finally talking about what really scared you." The room fell silent except for the sound of ghostly breathing. "Tell me," I said to the young soldier, "what's your name?" "Private Daniel Morrison, 11th Tennessee Infantry." "What were you thinking about when you died, Daniel?" His face crumpled. "My little sister. I promised Mama I'd come home to help with the harvest. Sarah was only 12, and she needed help with the heavy work. I kept thinking, who's going to take care of Sarah now? You were a good brother," I told him. "You died caring about your family. That's not failure, Daniel. That's love." One by one, I began talking to them. The Union boy who died thinking his mother would be ashamed of him for running when the cannonballs started falling. The Confederate sergeant who spent his last moments wishing he'd never volunteered, feeling like a coward for wanting to go home. The artillery officer who blamed himself for getting his whole unit killed with a bad order. Each time I talked to one of them, really listened to their pain, they became less solid. Their uniforms faded. Their wounds stopped bleeding. But Sarah and Marcus were still possessed by the officers, and they weren't ready to let go. "Enough!" Captain Davis shouted through Sarah. "These men died for their cause. You will not diminish their sacrifice with your modern weakness." "I'm not diminishing anything," I said. "I'm honoring their pain. They've been suffering for 132 years because no one understood that their minds were wounded too." The Confederate major possessing Marcus drew himself up to his full height. "A soldier endures, sir. We do not complain." And that's exactly the problem. You've been enduring instead of healing. You've been carrying trauma you were never meant to carry forever. I walked closer to Sarah, looking into eyes that belonged to Captain Davis. "What were you afraid of, Captain? In your last moments, what really scared you?" For a long moment, she just stared at me with cold military bearing. Then, quietly, "That I led my boys into a slaughter. That they trusted me and I got them killed for nothing. You were doing your duty with the information you had. You couldn't have known. But they died because of my orders. And now they've spent 132 years trying to undo that moment, trying to find a way to make it right. But it can't be undone, Captain. It can only be forgiven." Captain Davis looked around the room at his men. Some Union, some Confederate, all of them just scared boys who'd been trying to do what they thought was right. "I'm sorry," he whispered through Sarah's voice. "I'm so sorry, boys." The change was immediate. The ghostly soldiers began to fade, their faces peaceful for the first time in over a century. One by one, they nodded to their officers and simply let go. Marcus blinked and was himself again. "Ben, what happened? I feel like I just woke up from the strangest dream." Sarah took longer to come back. When she finally did, she was crying. "They were so young, Ben. They were all so terribly young." Outside, the fog was lifting. For the first time in days, I could see clear sky. But as we walked outside to breathe the clean air, I noticed something that made me smile. There were new monuments on the battlefield. Small stone markers that hadn't been there before, each one bearing a simple inscription. "Here lies a soldier who found peace." The Battle of Chickamauga was finally over. The official report blamed the whole incident on mass hysteria brought on by anniversary, stress, and atmospheric pressure changes. The reenactors recovered their memories within a few days, though some of them quietly told me they remembered things they couldn't possibly have known about the real battle. Sheriff Martinez called it the strangest case she'd ever worked, but she was grateful everyone came home alive and sane. The university gave Sarah and Marcus extended leave to deal with what they diplomatically called psychological stress from their research experience. But I knew the truth was more complicated. 3 weeks later, I was back at my station when I got a call from the VA hospital down in Atlanta. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in developing a new PTSD therapy program. Something about using historical empathy combined with traditional treatment methods. "How did you hear about my work?" "Don't be undumb," I asked the director. "Funny thing," she said. "We keep getting veterans calling us, saying a park ranger up on Lookout Mountain had helped them understand their trauma better than anyone they'd ever talked to. They said you made them feel like their pain wasn't a weakness." I looked out my window at the battlefield. It was quiet now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for 132 years. But sometimes, especially around sunset, I could still see faint figures walking among the trees. Not the angry, desperate ghosts from before, these were different. These were soldiers who had found peace, who came back sometimes just to watch over the place where they'd learned to let go. "I'd be interested in that program," I told the director. "Good, because we have about 300 Vietnam vets on our waiting list, and most of them specifically asked for you." That's how I ended up back in the teaching business, in a way. But now I teach healing instead of just studying trauma. I help people understand that being wounded, in body or mind, doesn't make you broken. It just means you need time and care to get better. The Chickamauga battlefield is different now. The Park Service noticed the change too. Visitor reports of strange feelings or unexplained sadness dropped to almost nothing. Tourists say the place feels peaceful now, contemplative rather than disturbing. But I know the real reason for the change. We built a small memorial near the visitor center, dedicated to all soldiers who carried invisible wounds. It doesn't explain what really happened here, but it doesn't need to. The people who visit understand. Sometimes I get calls from other parks, other battlefields where the reported incidents are starting to sound familiar. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, places where too many young men died with too much pain in their hearts. I always take those calls. Because I've learned something important in these mountains. The past isn't really past until we help it find peace. And sometimes, the dead just need someone to listen to their pain and tell them it's okay to finally let it go. The Battle of Chickamauga ended on the 20th of September, 1863. But the healing? That's still going on. And I'm proud to be part of it. My name is Vincent Meredith, and I need to tell you what happened on Pine Mountain Ridge in the summer of 1963. 16 years I worked as a ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest, and I thought I'd seen everything these Kentucky mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. People always said Pine Mountain Ridge was strange. The Cherokee folks who lived here before us called it the place where voices got stolen. I never paid much attention to old stories. My job was keeping the radio tower running and coordinating emergency calls. Simple work for a simple man. That June was the hottest anyone could remember. The thermometer hit 105 degrees most days, and everything was dying. Trees turned brown like it was October, and the animals just disappeared. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just silence that felt heavy as a blanket. I'd been up at the tower for 3 weeks straight. My new wife Sarah was worried about me being alone so long, but someone had to stay. The radio equipment needed constant checking, and with the heat playing tricks on the signals, I couldn't risk leaving it unattended. The tower sat right on the ridge's highest point, with 800-foot drops on both sides. On clear days, you could see for miles. But during that heat wave, everything shimmered like water. Made your eyes hurt to look too long. I'd been married to Sarah for 8 months. She came with 2 boys from her first marriage, twin 8-year-olds named Danny and Mark. Good kids, but they reminded me too much of the children my first wife Ellen and I never had. Ellen killed herself 2 years back. Pills and whiskey. Left a note saying she couldn't stand the quiet anymore. I understood what she meant now. The tower had been built in the 1942, replacing an old radio station that went dark under strange circumstances. The record said 3 operators died within a year, all from what the coroner called self-inflicted trauma. I found their old equipment in the basement, tubes blown out, wires melted like someone had run too much power through them. My job was keeping people connected. Forest Service radio, emergency channels, weather reports. I was good at it. Spent my whole adult life working with radios, and they never lied to me. People lied all the time, but radio signals were honest. They either worked or they didn't. That's what I told myself until the voices started coming through channels that shouldn't exist. The first strange call came on June 15th. I was checking the evening weather report when I heard Sarah's voice on the emergency frequency. She was crying, begging someone to help her boys. Said they were lost in the woods and getting dark. I grabbed my radio and called home. Sarah answered on the second ring, calm as anything. The boys were right there having dinner. When I asked about the call, she had no idea what I meant. Said she'd been cooking all day. I figured it was heat affecting the equipment. Sound could do funny things in weather like that. But when I checked the logs, there was no record of any transmission on that frequency. Nothing at all. The ozone smell started that same night, like lightning, but mixed with something rotten. It got stronger near the radio equipment, especially the old stuff in the basement. I thought maybe the heat was making the insulation break down. 3 days later, I heard my dead wife's voice. Ellen's voice came through clear as day on the emergency channel at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I wrote it down with shaking hands. Vincent, she said, and it was her, the same soft way she said my name when she was scared. Vincent, why did you let me die? I sat frozen in front of the radio for maybe 10 minutes. My finger hovered over the transmit button, but what could I say? Ellen was dead. I'd carried her casket. This had to be some kind of breakdown, heat stress making me hear things. But then she spoke again. You know I'm still here. You know I never left this mountain. Why won't you answer me? This time I grabbed the microphone. Who is this? This isn't funny. Silence. Just the soft hiss of static. I spent the rest of the night going through all the equipment, checking connections, looking for crossed wires or feedback loops. Everything was perfect. Every piece of equipment running exactly like it should. The next morning, Jim Henderson drove up in the supply truck. He was supposed to spell me for a few days so I could go home and see Sarah and the boys. Jim was a good man, 20 years younger than me, with a wife and baby girl down in Corbin. You look like hell, Vince, he said, unloading boxes of batteries and replacement tubes. When's the last time you slept? I wanted to tell him about the voices. But how do you explain something like that? Instead, I showed him around the equipment, went over the daily checks, and told him to call if anything seemed wrong. Define wrong, he joked. If only I'd known. I left Jim at the tower and drove down the mountain. The road was steep and winding, cut right into the rock face. Halfway down, my radio crackled. Base, this is Henderson. Jim's voice, but something was off. He spoke too slowly, like he was reading words he didn't understand. Go ahead, Jim. Just wanted to let you know I'm settling in fine. Found some interesting equipment down in the basement. Looks like someone left it on. My blood went cold. I'd specifically told Jim to stay out of the basement. The old equipment down there wasn't connected to anything. Jim, stay away from that stuff. It's not safe. Oh, I think it's working better than you know. The voices down here are much clearer. The radio went dead. I turned the truck around and floored it back up the mountain. The engine overheated twice, steam pouring from under the hood, but I kept driving. Something was very wrong. I found Jim in the main radio room, sitting, perfectly still in front of the equipment. His eyes were open, but he didn't respond when I called his name. The radio was broadcasting a conversation between two men I'd never heard before, talking about a fire in 1943. Jim? I touched his shoulder. He turned to look at me, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice anymore. It was older, rougher, with a thick accent I couldn't place. Boys never should have come up here, he said. This mountain takes voices, keeps them forever. Now it's got another one. I backed away. Jim, it's me. It's Vince. He stood up, still wearing that wrong voice like an ill-fitting coat. Jim's listening to his baby cry. Been crying for 20 years now, ever since she died. Wants to go to her. His baby's alive. She's fine. Jim smiled, but it wasn't his smile. Not anymore. That's when I saw the blood on his hands. Fresh blood, dripping from his fingernails like he'd clawed something, or someone. He lunged at me, still speaking in that stranger's voice, telling me about all the operators who died on this mountain. All the voices that got trapped here when they died. All the people down in the towns who were getting calls from dead relatives, being told to do things no living person would ever ask. I hit him with a wrench from the toolkit. He went down hard, blood spreading across the floor, but his mouth kept moving. Different voices now, dozens of them, all talking at once through his torn throat. I ran for the truck, but it wouldn't start. The radio inside was broadcasting conversations between people who'd been dead for decades. All of them talking about the mountain, about voices that wouldn't stay buried, about the way sound could live forever if it found the right place to hide. I was trapped on Pine Mountain Ridge with whatever had taken Jim, and the sun was going down. The voices followed me everywhere after that. They came through every radio, every piece of electronic equipment, even the old wind-up alarm clock I kept in my bunk. They knew things they shouldn't know. Private things about Sarah, about Ellen, about mistakes I'd made that no one else could possibly remember. Jim was still alive, but something else was using his body. It would speak in his voice for a few seconds, begging for help, and then switch to someone else. An old woman talking about her lost children. A man describing how he'd fallen from the ridge in 1952. A little girl who kept asking why her daddy wouldn't come home. I locked myself in the radio room and tried to call for help, but every frequency was compromised. When I tried to reach the Forest Service, Ellen's voice answered. When I called Sarah's number, I heard my own voice telling her I was never coming home. The worst part was knowing that somewhere down the mountain, Sarah was getting calls from me that I wasn't making. Calls where I said terrible things, confessed to killing Ellen, threatened to hurt the boys. I could. hear my own voice doing it through the equipment, but I wasn't speaking. On the second night, the Cherokee elder Marcus Crow Eagle climbed up to the tower. He was 90 years old and moved like a man half his age. I'd seen him in town a few times but never talked to him. "You need to leave this place," he said without any greeting. "I can't. Something's wrong with my equipment, operator, and the voice thieves are feeding." He looked at the radio equipment like it was a snake. Every 20 years, they wake up hungry. They take voices, steal identity, make people forget who they really are. That's just old stories. Your friend in there is speaking with words of the dead. You think that's a story? I wanted to argue, but Jim chose that moment to start talking in the voice of a woman who died in 1924. She was describing how she'd thrown her children off the ridge because the voices told her they weren't really her children anymore. Marcus nodded grimly. The thieves make copies of voices, but they're always a little wrong, like an echo that comes before the sound. People hear their loved ones saying things they'd never say, and they believe it because it sounds exactly right. How do I stop it? You can't stop them. They live in the spaces between sounds, in the empty places where echoes are born, but you can starve them. Cut the connections, make them find another mountain. That's when the power went out. Emergency lights kicked on, casting everything in hellish red. The backup generator started automatically, but instead of normal electrical hum, I heard voices. Dozens of them, all speaking through the generator's engine noise. Jim walked out of the back room, moving like a puppet with half its strings cut. When he spoke, it was in perfect chorus. Multiple voices saying the same words at exactly the same time. "Marcus Crow Eagle, we remember your grandfather." He tried to warn people too. Want to know what happened to him? Marcus went pale. He died of old age, natural causes. He threw himself from the ridge after we made him speak to his dead son for 3 days straight. The son told him all about the war, about dying in France, about how lonely he was. Your grandfather couldn't bear to stop talking to him. The old man's hands shook. "You're lying. We never lie. We just repeat what people say. Your grandfather's voice is here too. Want to hear him?" The radio crackled, and an old man's voice filled the room, speaking in Cherokee. Marcus started crying. "What's he saying?" I asked. He's telling me he's sorry. Sorry for leaving us. He says the voices promised they'd let him talk to his son forever if he just stepped off the ridge. Jim's body smiled with all those stolen faces. Every voice we take makes us stronger. We know every secret, every fear, every weakness. And now we have new voices calling down to the town. Your wife has been getting interesting calls from you, Vincent. So have the police. My radio crackled. Sarah's voice, hysterical with fear. "He's coming home tonight. He said he's going to finish what he started with Ellen. He said the boys remind him too much of the children he never had." But I was standing right here. I'd never said any of those things. The thing wearing Jim's body kept smiling. "She's packing the boys into the car right now. Going to drive away in the dark on those dangerous mountain roads. Such a shame about the bridge on Route 119. The one with the broken guardrail." "Sarah knows that bridge is out," I said, but my voice cracked. "Does she? Or does she just know that her husband is coming home with murder on his mind? When people are scared enough, they stop thinking clearly. They make mistakes." I ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The lock wasn't engaged, but something was holding it shut. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Marcus grabbed my arm. "They're feeding off your fear. Every emotion makes them stronger. I have to warn Sarah." "With what?" "Every radio on this mountain belongs to them now." That's when I heard my own voice coming through the speakers, calling Sarah's number, telling her exactly which road to take out of town. The road that led straight to that broken bridge. Lightning started flashing outside, but there was no thunder. The storm was silent, just brilliant white light that made the whole ridge look like the inside of a camera flash. Each lightning strike seemed to make the voices stronger, clearer, more numerous. Marcus was praying in Cherokee, but even his prayers got picked up by the radios and repeated back as twisted versions. His grandfather's voice joined in, turning the sacred words into something obscene. The thing controlling Jim stood in the center of the room, arms spread wide, welcoming the storm. "Every electrical discharge feeds us. Every signal that passes through this equipment makes us more real. We are the echoes that exist between heartbeats, the silence that lives inside every word. The air itself started to shimmer, like heat waves, but cold. I could see shapes moving in it, not solid, but definitely there. Faces made of sound waves, bodies constructed from stolen voices. "We've been here since the first humans spoke on this ridge," the collective voice said through Jim. "Every word ever spoken leaves a trace, an echo. We collect those echoes, preserve them, make them our own. But preserved voices grow hungry. They want to speak again, to influence the living world." My radio equipment was broadcasting conversations from every era. Civil War soldiers calling for backup, Cherokee warriors warning about white settlers, children from the 1,950 asking their mothers for help. All of their voices were being used to manipulate people across 3 counties, making them do things no sane person would do. "Why?" I asked. "Because chaos feeds us. Fear feeds us. When people stop trusting their own ears, when they can't tell the difference between truth and lies, reality breaks down. In that breakdown, we grow stronger." Marcus stopped praying and looked at me with ancient eyes. "They're not just taking voices, they're taking identity itself. Every person who believes the wrong voice loses a piece of who they are." The radio crackled with Sarah's voice. "Boys, get in the car. Daddy's coming home." "No," I whispered. "She's already driving. Route 119, just like you told her. The bridge is only 5 miles from town." I grabbed the microphone and started transmitting on every frequency I could find. "Sarah, this is Vincent. Do not take Route 119. The bridge is out." I repeat, "The bridge is out." But my own voice came back through the speakers, saying the opposite. "Sarah, ignore that transmission. Take Route 119. It's the only safe way out." The collective laughed through Jim's mouth. "She hears 2 voices that sound exactly like you. Which one should she trust? The one telling her to stay on the dangerous mountain roads with her murderous husband, or the one offering escape?" I could see it happening like a movie in my head. Sarah, terrified, driving too fast in the dark, the boys crying in the back seat. The broken guardrail, coming up with no warning, the car going through and tumbling 200 feet into the rocky creek below. "Stop," I said. "Please. Give us your voice willingly, and we'll let them live. Become one of us, and your family will be safe. If I give you my voice, how do I know you'll keep your word?" "We always keep our word. We just use it in ways people don't expect." Marcus grabbed my shoulder. "Don't listen. They're creatures of sound and echo. Their power comes from mimicking what already exists. They can't create anything truly new." That's when it hit me. "You can only copy," I said. "You can't make original sounds." The collective's confidence wavered for just a second. "We can make any sound that has ever been made, but not sounds that have never existed." I walked over to the main transmitter, the most powerful piece of equipment on the mountain. Marcus understood what I was planning and started backing toward the door. "Vincent, don't." I cranked the power to maximum and opened my mouth. Instead of words, I screamed, not in any frequency the human voice normally uses, but something higher, something that had never been made before. I pushed my vocal cords beyond their normal range, into frequencies that felt like tearing. The effect was immediate. Every stolen voice in the room started screaming too, but they were just echoing my sound, not creating their own. The collective couldn't control something it had never heard before. Jim collapsed, blood pouring from his mouth and ears. The shapes in the air started dissolving. Lightning struck the tower directly, sending power surging through every piece of equipment. I kept screaming that impossible note, feeling my throat tear, tasting blood, but not stopping. The transmitter was broadcasting my voice at maximum power, sending that original frequency across hundreds of miles. All around the mountain, radios exploded. Car radios, house radios, police radios. Anything electronic that could receive a signal overloaded and died. And with them died the collective's ability to reach the living world. The last thing I heard before my eardrums burst was Sarah's real voice on a different frequency. "Vincent? Vincent, the strangest thing happened. My radio just died, but I suddenly knew I needed to turn around. Like someone was telling me to come home instead. Then, everything went silent. Permanently silent. I've been deaf for 40 years now. complete hearing loss from that night on Pine Mountain Ridge. The doctors said it was caused by acoustic trauma, but they couldn't explain why my eardrums had burst from the inside out. Sarah and the boys made it home safe. They'd turned around just 2 miles from the broken bridge. Sarah said she'd heard my voice telling her to come home, but not through any radio. She heard it inside her head, clear as day, speaking words of love instead of threats. Jim Henderson survived, but he never spoke again. Something about the experience broke the part of his brain that controls speech. He communicates through writing now, and he never writes about what happened that night. The official report blamed everything on solar flare activity, radio interference, equipment malfunction, heat-related hallucinations. The tower was permanently shut down and left to rust. Sometimes hikers find it and take pictures, but their cameras never work right up there. Something about electromagnetic residue. I became the Forest Service's expert on unusual acoustic phenomena. Turns out there are places all over the world where sounds behave strangely, where voices echo across decades, where the dead seem to speak through electronic equipment. I can't hear these things anymore, which makes me uniquely qualified to investigate them. My deafness protects me. The collective on Pine Mountain Ridge isn't dead. I can see them sometimes, shapes moving in the air around old radio equipment. But they can't touch me, can't steal what I can't hear. Sarah and I stayed married until she died of cancer in 1995. The boys grew up strong and never showed any signs of being affected by that night. Sometimes I wonder if my sacrifice protected them somehow, if losing my hearing was the price for their safety. I still patrol these mountains, watching for signs of the mimicry plague spreading to new areas. Because it's not contained to Pine Mountain Ridge. It never was. The collective was just one colony, one nest of voice thieves in an ecosystem I'm only beginning to understand. Every year, there are reports of impossible radio transmissions, dead people calling their relatives, voices giving advice no living person would give, police dispatchers receiving calls from their own voices, sending units to places where no one needs help. The Cherokee were right about one thing. Some places are hungry. They feed on human sound, human communication, human trust in their own ears. In our modern world, with radio and television and cell phones, these places have more opportunities than ever to reach out and touch the living. I carry a notebook now instead of a radio. When people report strange voices, I write down their stories. I can't hear the lies anymore, which means I'm one of the few people who might recognize the truth. The mimicry plague is still spreading. Every time someone hears a voice they trust telling them to do something wrong, it grows a little stronger. Every time a person stops believing their own ears, the collective wins another victory. I'm telling you this story not because I think you'll believe it, but because you need to know. When you hear someone you love saying something they'd never say, trust your heart instead of your ears. When electronic voices tell you to do things that feel wrong, turn off the device and walk away. And if you're ever driving alone at night and your radio starts broadcasting conversations between dead people, don't listen long enough to recognize the voices. Some echoes should never be answered,